Thank you all for coming this afternoon. I did want to take a couple moments to point out there's a banner in the very back of the room that's available to anyone who wants to add some color to it. It is a banner that was created and meant to inspire children, so please add your own piece of color either during the break or even if you happen to get up to get an appetizer during the presentation. You can also, there's markers and Sharpies out there for you to use. David J. Schonfeld, MD, a developmental behavioral pediatrician, directs the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement at the Suzanne Dworak Peck School of Social Work at the University of Southern California. For over 30 years, he has supported schools in the aftermath of crisis. His school-based research involves children's understanding of and adjustments to serious illnesses and death, and school-based interventions to promote adjustments and risk prevention. He is a member of the National Biodefense Science Board and a former commissioner of the National Commissions on Children and Disasters and the Sandy Hook Advisory Commission. Please help me welcome Dr. David Schonfeld.
Well, it's good to see all of you. Let me know if you have trouble hearing me. I'm going to remind you that the bathrooms are actually that way, so you can go around. And we will take a break in the middle, but it'll be a brief break. So if at any point you want to just get up and stretch, get something to eat, get something to drink, use the bathroom, please feel free to do so. That will not bother me at all. It's a little less good if you just fall asleep where you're sitting. So it's probably a little better to get up and kind of walk around. So what I'm going to do is I'm planning on covering really two topics. I'm going to start with how do you support children after a crisis. And I'm going to be talking about national crisis events drawn from some of the communities we've responded to. But I do want to emphasize that the same strategies hold if you have a child who has an individual or a family crisis. So you don't have to wait for a wildfire or an earthquake before you use some of these strategies. If you go to school, if you work in a clinic, if you work anywhere, or if you just stay home with your own kids, there's a good chance that you're going to see a child who's upset about something, and you can use these approaches. I'm going to talk about psychological first aid and spend a lot of time on some of the symptoms of adjustment reactions that you may see, and talk some about the timeline for adjustment. What are the stages that communities go through in terms of the recovery process? We'll probably take the break sometime around there and then turn to supporting grieving children. And I'm going to emphasize also some free resources that you have from the Coalition to Support Grieving Students. It's one of the projects that we run in the center. And at the end, if you don't ask a lot of questions, we will have time for me to describe the center to you. So if you actually just want this to stay completely relevant, you'll ask questions so that we don't have to go through that. I don't mind talking about it, but you might not want to hear it. But seriously, I do want to tell you some about the center so you know about the free services and resources that we provide nationally, so you can take advantage of it, particularly since we're California neighbors. I also will ask that if you have any questions that you ask them when you have them, as opposed to waiting to the end. I don't particularly like to do that. Now it is a somewhat, it's not that it's too large a room, but it's spread out. So my peripheral vision isn't that great, and I'll get motion sick if I keep looking. So if anyone asks a question, then people should shout out and let me know that it's there. It keeps me on my toes. Okay, so I'm going to start by talking about psychological first aid, or PFA is what's called in the field. How many of you have actually heard about psychological first aid before? Okay, so a number of you have. For those of you who do psychological first aid training, I will encourage you to think of this maybe as a way of summarizing some of the information for your presentations. For the others, it'll be an introduction. So psychological first aid is something that's usually administered to populations. You can use these strategies with an individual, but they're generally used by professionals or lay people who have been trained to be done in the aftermath of a major event to a community. So it's more of a population-based strategy. The idea is to provide it broadly to all those who were impacted by the event, not those who are symptomatic, but those who were just involved. And you give supportive services to foster normative coping and accelerate the natural healing process. The type of context might be if your 9/11 happens. I was in Connecticut at the time, so this would be something that you might go and do in a parking lot of a train station where commuters commuted into the World Trade Center a day or two afterwards when family members of those who died are in the parking lots picking up the cars. and you would just walk through and talk to those people and use these type of strategies. That's a type of setting. I mean, you can clearly do it with a community that's had a natural disaster or a school that's had a shooting. The point I would like to make is that all staff who work in the school should understand the likely reactions and how to help children cope, because anyone that interacts with children can be a potential source of assistance and support. But if they're unprepared, particularly if they're perceived as insensitive, they will actually be a source of further distress. And so, I've done a lot of work in hospitals. So I was chair of a large clinical program in a very large children's hospital. And we had about 25,000 patient visits a year, to give you some sense, just in developmental behavioral peds. I think it's the biggest in the world. And they used to do phone satisfaction surveys of random samples of the patients that were seen in the clinic. And then they would transcribe them verbatim, and I would actually read them. I had the position for 7.5 years. They did this every week or two. They were all the same. I read all of them, but quite honestly, they all said the same thing. And what they would say is, my child we saw a lot of kids with developmental disabilities. The wait list was very long, as it is nationally. Families would travel sometimes 3-4 hours, sometimes stay in a hotel just to get their first visit. And they would say, we were running late, the traffic was bad, we arrived late to the appointment, and that really nice lady at the front desk, they never remember the name, by the way, the really nice lady at the front desk said, don't worry, the doctor will see you, your child can go to the bathroom, please, we understand that you're late. Of course, the doctor would be the one seeing them late, but we won't get into that. But the staff member, and then the comment would be, this place is magical. So the issue was that one kind word from a staff member is how they judge the whole institution. But if they arrived and the person in the parking lot said, I'm sorry, there is no parking for you, we're filled, and they said, but my kid's sick, I'm trying to get in the hospital, if they say, well, that's not really my problem, that's how you will be known. And so it makes, because to be quite honest, I don't mean this to be rude, but most of the families actually had no way of judging the actual quality of the clinical care. I mean, we evaluated very complex situations, and we told them what we thought. It's not like they could figure out, they usually couldn't get a second opinion. So they judged it based on how they thought we cared. So it makes a very big difference. You want to make sure everyone can do this. The other issue is that individuals who are not clinical staff are often going to be the ones who provide the actual support. And they observe things that the other clinical staff don't observe. I went to one school, one of the cafeteria workers noticed that a child was going through the trash and then found out that the kid was looking for food to bring home. And that's how they figured out the need in the family. So you want every staff member to make enlightened observations and to be able to support a kid. So I went to one school that had had a mass shooting, and this was a hostage situation, and one of the kids was murdered during the rescue attempt. So I was talking with the cafeteria workers, and I asked how the kids were doing. And one of the cafeteria workers looked at me and said, well, they're wearing long-sleeve shirts, and we're worried. And I was like, why would that worry you? And she said, well, they hold out their lunch trays, the sleeves are retracting, and we can see they're cutting more, and we think the girls are trying to cover that up. And then I asked them, did you tell the clinic staff or any of the mental health staff in the school? And they looked at me and said, no, we're the cafeteria staff. So I think that you really want to make sure that their observations are seen, but they also have different connections with kids. So I talked to the custodians in that school, and they said they were worried about the kids because they were out of control. So I asked one of the custodians, give me an example. He said, the other day I was walking through the cafeteria, and the kids got up and they left their lunch trays. I reminded them, but they ignored me. So I stopped them and I said, you know what? If you don't pick up those trays, no one's going to clean them up after you. So the kids went over, they picked up the trays, and they threw them out of the door of the building. And they turned to the custodian and said, are you happy now? They're not on the table. And he looked at me and he just said, these are really good kids. They would have never done this prior to the shooting. But what worries me most is they would never do that in front of the principal, any of the administrators, any of the teachers, or their parents. These kids let us see a different side of them, and we're really worried about them. And then the other one said, yes, and the kids are starting to have sex on campus during school hours. We know who, we know where. And so the issue is different staff have different access, and they see different things. That actually sounded like a more interesting job to me then. But It made the job much more interesting once they told me that. I do have to say parenthetically, then one of the custodians said, oh, come on, we did that when we were students here. And part of me wanted to go there. Like, which ones of you? Like, where? Show me in the building. Anyway, but I did not, because I'm a professional. I just think these things, I just don't say them out loud. So, and I remember I went to one school where I did about 6 hours of in-service on the same thing you're getting in 3 hours. And they invited everyone in the school. And it was the 2 days before school started. And one of the, I think she was a cafeteria worker, she came up and said to me, I've been here 25 years. This is the first time I've been invited to a professional development day. Thank you for recognizing that support professionals provide support. And so they really want to learn these strategies because they're the front line for the schools. And they're often also in the background as well. So you want to make sure that everyone has the training. So let me go quickly through this. The first is, this is what the PFA steps are as described by the American Red Cross, and there are other models. The first is observation or awareness, and I'm going to go through some of the signs to look for. You then want to make a connection. You want to help people feel comfortable and at ease, and you want to be kind, calm, and compassionate. People pick up on how you're speaking more than on actually what you say. I had a situation where someone who was working with me got diagnosed with cancer. And she called me up and actually reached me before she reached her husband. And then she asked me to come with her husband to her first oncology visit. So I go to the visit. It's about an hour-long visit. I thought the oncologist did a very nice job. He was very clear. He was thoughtful. He went through everything and answered all the questions. We walked out of the room, and she looked at me, and she just said, so I don't have cancer. And I said, I don't understand. What do you mean by that? You just gave written consent for surgery on Monday to remove your tumor. You also gave written consent to start chemotherapy for your cancer. What do you mean you don't have cancer? How did you walk away with that assumption? And she just looked at me and she said, he seemed so hopeful. I'm like, he did. He's hopeful that he'll be able to cure your cancer. But you do know you have it. Otherwise, you just wasted an hour with an oncologist, and I don't know what you thought you were giving permission to. And actually, she was successfully treated. It's been like 15 years since that happened. But the point is that people just pick up on the tone of what we say. So we have to be cautious about how we speak with people when they're in distress. You also want to assist with basic needs. I'm going to get to that on the next slide. You want to listen to individuals when they're upset and find out what they're upset about. There's a tendency for people to assume they know what's upsetting the situation, and they speak from their own perspective. And they give information that they find reassuring. But if you don't know why the person is upset, you can't actually reassure them. If two people are talking and each person is speaking from their own perspective, clinically we call that arguing. And it doesn't reassure people. And we tend to do that in medicine all the time. So I'll give an example of when I was attending in one of the clinics. It was like 5:30 on Friday. Walk-in clinic's supposed to close at 4:30. Nurses wanted to go home. The doctors needed to be someplace else. And it was flu season, and we had all these kids that were dehydrated and getting IV hydration. So I went to the physicians came to me. There was 2 different toddlers in 2 different rooms. I actually think they were below toddlers, like probably about 8 months old. And both of them had the same situation. Child was rehydrated intravenously and was told they were ready to go home, and the families were like, my child is too sick to go home. If you're closing, I need to go to the emergency department. And the physicians were arguing with them about how you don't need to go to the emergency room because, of course, your urine-specific gravity is 1007. This was not convincing them. And then they were talking about their electrolytes have, returned to normal and all that. They don't even know what that means and, quite honestly, don't care. So I went in to talk with them. And in the first parent, I said, it sounds like you don't feel comfortable leaving right now. And he said, no. And I said, why? And he said, I think my daughter's too sick. And I said, what do you think might happen that you're worried about? And he said, she could get further dehydrated. And I said, and what's the worst that would happen then? He said, well, she could die. And I said, do you know how long it would take for her to die from dehydration? And he said, I have no idea. And so I said, okay, when does she usually go to bed? Well, about 7:30. Does she sleep through the night? Yes. So if she doesn't take a single drop of fluid before she goes to bed, She will sleep through the night the same way she does every night, and she will not be dehydrated by the morning, unless she's vomiting excessively or has a lot of diarrhea, and she has neither of those. So you can bring her home, and you don't have to feed her again. And the clinic opens at 8 in the morning tomorrow on Saturday, and you're welcome to come back, and we'll just check her. But she cannot become dehydrated by then, unless she's having a lot of fluid loss, in which case then you can come to the emergency room. So he looked at me and he goes, okay, then I'm going home. I'll see you tomorrow morning. Got an appointment, and he went home. I went into the next room. She said the same thing. My daughter's too sick. And I said, what are you afraid is going to happen? Well, I think she'll keep vomiting. And I said, and what do you think is going to happen if she vomits? And she looked at me and she said, she won't sleep. And I said, and then what would happen? She said, and then I won't be able to sleep. So I looked at her and I said, what worries you about not sleeping tonight? And she said, I'm in a drug rehab program. I've just gotten off cocaine. If I have one more night that's sleepless, I will start using again. And I am scared of doing that and losing my child. So I said, okay, thank you for sharing that. Would you feel comfortable if I called the residential program you're in and asked someone to watch your child this evening if your child wakes up, or at the very least to watch you, to make sure you don't start using? And then we can see you in the morning. And she said, oh, if you do that, I'm fine. Called over to the rehab program. They said, oh, yeah, we'll watch her. Yeah, she hasn't slept for a couple nights. I understand that's difficult. And then she said, thank you, and she went home. Now, when I talk with physicians, I tell them, they say, well, we don't really have the time to find out their stories. And I'm like, you don't have the time not to find out the stories. Because I will assure you that if I had not done that, and I told you the questions and the answers, it took like 5 to 10 minutes for each family. They would have gone to the emergency room. The emergency room would have tried to deny them, which they legally can't do. So they would have called me as the attending. I'd have to have the discussion. They'd say, what were you thinking? Their labs are fine. Why are they here? They're wasting money. The HMO is not going to pay for it. It's really not faster, I assure you. So the issue is you have to listen to people, and you have to find out why are they concerned. And then what you need to do is give them reassurance to the extent that you can. I would never give false reassurance. Give realistic reassurance that responds to their needs and their concerns. And if you do that, even if you do it well, some people remain concerned because they're in crisis. So they should be concerned. So if someone remains concerned, what you don't want to say is, you shouldn't be concerned, because that just doesn't make their reactions legitimate, suggests you're not listening to them, or that you're not connecting or caring, and they'll just stop listening to you as a result. So what you want to do is, and we do this with kids all the time, there's no reason to be worried. Well, if you're worried, that is the reason. You don't need anything more than that. So what you can say is, I'm not concerned, and let me give you some information that I have that may explain why I'm less concerned. But if they say I'm still worried, then you say, okay, let's talk about how do you deal with that worry. So then you turn to encouraging good coping. And you also need to help people connect so that they can continue to do this work, whether it's get support or sometimes they can help others. That's another way to help individuals in distress. You want to give accurate and timely information, particularly as the event is unfolding, but not excessive information. I was talking to a friend. How many of you have ever been to the bodies exhibit? With the cadavers? Okay, I'm not going to ask you publicly, but at some point you can tell me why you would want to go to something like my friend told me he had gone to that, and my reaction was, we did anatomy together. Like, I've seen dead bodies. Is there a reason why you would do this on your weekend? Anyway, so I was like, okay. I'm not trying to be critical. I'm like, I haven't gone because, quite honestly, cadavers just don't. I've been there, done that, and I don't really want to spend more time with it. But I said, did you like it? And he goes, yeah, it was fascinating. It was really very interesting, all the things you could see. And I said, well, how did your wife like it? And he said, oh, she did like it. She seemed interested, but then we had to leave quickly at the end. And I'm like, why? And he said, well, I was explaining on one of the cadavers the outpatient surgical procedure she was going to have the next morning, and she suddenly became ill. And I'm like, I was just on the phone. I go, dude, you really don't know what you did. He's a really sensitive guy. And I go, you don't realize the person was dead. I mean, it didn't turn out well for them. Why would you ever show that to someone you love right before they go in for this procedure? It was like, she seemed interested. And I'm like, okay. So I think sometimes we give too much information, So you want to just give behaviorally relevant information. What do they need to know so they feel they understand what's happened? They don't have to understand everything. They just have to feel they know what's going on and know what to do. You then want to suggest a referral resource because your goal in PFA is to engage them and refer them. You're not spending a lot of time with them. You have maybe 10 minutes with a stranger. And then you want to end the conversation, and that's sometimes the hardest part. So those are the steps in PFA. Does anyone have questions about them before I go on? I've seen people have an 8-hour curriculum on this. You can imagine what that's like. But anyway, so they're fairly basic steps, and the reason I go through it is I've been to so many crisis events, and I remember going to one recently, and it was actually with early childhood educators, and they looked at me and they said, we don't know what to do after this large natural disaster. All we can do is hug the kids, help them feel safe, give them some structure, listen to them, and support them. But we don't have any training in how to support people after crisis. I'm like, you could sit through 8 hours of this, but that's basically what you're doing. That's what the kids need. I don't know what else you think is going on for people who have gone through training. So if it seems basic, it is pretty basic, but it's actually what's recommended as a first step. Now, in addition to kind of psychological first aid, you also want to meet people's basic needs. And so I always tell the story. I was working with a large healthcare system, and we were going over a tabletop activity for a chemical terrorist attack and what the health system would do to try and do on-site decontamination. And after they finished the scenario, they looked at me and they said, well, what are some of the behavioral health needs that the population might need? So I said, well, let me see if I got the situation. You've got hundreds of people in an athletic event. You make an announcement that they've been exposed to a chemical terrorist agent like sarin. They can't see or smell it, but it will kill them if you don't do something quickly. So you strip them naked, you hose them down with water, and you remove everything on their person, and you don't get it back. Like, they don't take your car keys and wipe sarin off and say, here, you might need this to get in your house. No, they put them in contamination bags, biohazard bags, forensic bags. I don't know if you're ever going to see it again. Certainly not in time to get home. So at that point, these people are scared, afraid that they're going to die. They're cold and wet. They have no clothing. They have no credit card. They have no driver's license, no car keys, no home keys, no cell phone. They don't have cash. So they have no way of getting food, shelter, or even getting to their home or contacting people. So I kind of looked at them and I said, well, I know what they need. I don't even have to give a screening survey. I'm psychic that way. And I felt that, I was doing a lot of this work at a national level, and everyone was talking in acronyms. I actually hate acronyms, but I realized if I don't make up an acronym, I'm not seen as credible. So I'm like, I can play that game just like anyone else. I remember I was at one meeting, this was a long time ago, and there were all these federal folks there, and they said, it's WMD. And I'm like, so I turned to the person next to me. I go, what's a WMD? And he goes, it's weapons of mass destruction. And I'm like, couldn't it also be confused to be weapons of minimal destruction? And he goes, no. And I looked at him and I go, isn't it kind of assumed that weapons cause destruction? Isn't that why they're called weapons? So you don't actually need the MD, it should just be W. Or you could say weapons, which is 2 syllables, whereas WMD is 3, and it takes longer. So it's an acronym that's inefficient because it doesn't shorten it. Okay, he just thought I was creepy. He did not talk to me for the whole rest of the conference. So I decided I can't argue with them about their acronyms. They got to have them. So I made one up, and it was UWF for underwear first. That's what people need in this situation. And I spent some time in hospital administration. And if you call it brief therapy, you can bill under Medicaid. So it works at so many levels. And so the point is you really need to deal with people's basic needs before they're able to address their other emotional needs. So you have to start with safety, security, food, shelter, communication, and reunification with family and loved ones. And staff have their own basic needs. And your crisis plans need to address them as a priority. Because you really can't expect the adults, even the professionals and the leaders, to put aside their own basic needs for an extended period of time to help kids recover, because you shouldn't ever have to make that choice. I went to one school. They had gone through a large natural disaster with a lot of homes devastated and some deaths that had occurred as well. And I was meeting with the principal of an elementary school on the first day back to school. This had happened right before the end of the school year, so they had this summer intervening. And I was asking the principal, I said, how are you impacted by this? And she looked at me and she goes, well, my home was destroyed. And I said, well, where are you living? And she looked at me and she said, well, I'm living in my mother's house in her basement. And I just said, how's that going? And she was such a sweet woman. She just looked at me. There's a reason why she was a principal. She just said there were some very legitimate reasons why I moved out of my mother's home in the first place. They persist. That's all she said. Like, we didn't even have to go beyond that. And so I said, well, are you looking for a place, to move? Someplace where you don't have to be in your mother's basement. And she just said, I really can't. I got divorced a week or two before this happened. I don't really have the financial resources or a partner. And I'm trying to help my school after, deaths of members of the school community and many of them losing their homes. And she looked at me and she goes, what am I going to do? Take off a day of work to just go look for a place to live? What will staff think about that? And I said, they'll think you're exercising professional self-care and showing an effective model of how to take care of yourself, and that will give them permission to look for a home themselves. That's what they'll think. Living in your mother's basement is going to make you an ineffective leader. You're not, until you get out of your mother's basement, I don't really think you can lead the school. So what I find is you have to sometimes push the leaders to take care of their own needs. But if you are a leader, you need to set up strategies to make sure that those needs are met. And so sometimes what we do in schools, often what we do is we tell them, just hire substitutes the first couple days back. And that way they can roam through the schools so that teachers and other staff can leave the classroom without abandoning their kids, and they can have their needs taken care of. So if they're worried about, I went to do one presentation after Superstorm Sandy it's actually for one of the teachers union, and they had already had my session scheduled before the storm hit. And I went ahead because I actually had already arrived in the city, and when everything happened, so it was like, I can go fly back, but there are no flights. So they went ahead. They didn't have electricity in the building until that morning, and they didn't have heat that day, and it was very cold. And so it was like, you can't use PowerPoint because you really don't have the systems back up and running. People will have to huddle together to stay warm. But anyway, so I was talking with one of the people who helped set this up. It was in a leadership position. And her mother was living with her now because her apartment or home had been flooded and her best friend had died in the flooding. And so she had just gone to the funeral, and she was telling me that she came back from the funeral and got stuck between the front door of the building and the door of the apartment. I guess she had the key for one, but not the other. So she stood there for like 6 hours until her daughter came back, and she said, I'm really worried about her, and I just found out she doesn't have heat in the apartment and it's freezing, and I'm afraid she won't know what to do. And I was like, go home. I don't understand why you're here. She goes, well, I'm running this thing. And I go, yes, but you're afraid your mother's going to die. That will upset you. You should go. Or take care of it. Why are you talking to me? Like, I can introduce myself, just go. Fortunately, it's a large, it's New York City schools. The head of maintenance for the school system said, I know a lot of contractors, which I'm sure they do. And he got on the phone and he was like, I called in a favor. They'll be there in 15 minutes. Your mother will have heat. And so then she was like, okay, I can now do it. But the point is, I find I have to say, why are you here? Take care of your family. Take care of those that you love. Because otherwise, you're not going to be able to if you don't take care of yourself, you can't take care of others. So that's kind of just basic needs. I just want to underscore that whatever you do, you need to make sure that you meet those needs. Any questions about it? I know that's kind of, it is basic, so probably not much question. So let me turn now to some of the symptoms. So psychological first aid given to a population, meet the basic needs of anyone who needs it, and that'll help a lot, but it doesn't do everything. So there are some kids and adults who are going to need more than that. So this slide outlines some of the symptoms of adjustment reactions that you may see after a crisis. Again, a major crisis event involving a community or personal or family crisis. Now, the most common symptom is not up here, and that's nothing. I'm going to get to that later. Most individuals, even when they're in extreme distress, are not going to show that. And you will not know that they've been through that. So if you do know they've been through an event, you provide support and assistance before you see symptoms. You don't wait for something. You know, a lot of times people go, oh, they seem to be coping well. And I'm like, their family member just died last night. Like, I don't care, the kid's upset. And if the kid's not upset that their parent died, that's probably also a problem, and you might want to think about that. So the issue is, I'm going to go over the symptoms, but don't just look for them. So the first one is sleep problems. Trouble falling asleep, trouble staying asleep, frequent wakenings, inability to waken on time, nightmares, disrupted sleep. When that happens, and when kids don't sleep, parents don't sleep, and when parents don't sleep, pediatricians don't sleep. So we really care about this one. So you really need to work on sleep hygiene and make sure that people are getting sleep. It's one of the few symptoms where we go for symptomatic treatment. Now, I've done this work for more than 30 years. I haven't written for prescription for medication for any sleep aid for someone who's been through a crisis. So I am not saying that that's what you have to do, but talking about how, you know, what's good sleep hygiene, what can you do to make sure that the child can fall asleep? You know, if you're in a shelter, you just imagine when you're in a shelter, people have different bedtimes, different temperatures they like, different levels of lighting. Like, I've been married like 40 years. No, I guess more like 35. But I've been together with my wife since the beginning of high school, so it just seems like it's a very long time. But, and I'm not complaining about that, but for whatever reason, she can't stand my alarm clock because it's lit. And I'm like, well, dear, you can't read it if it's dark. She goes, well, I need it completely dark. And I go, and yet it won't be. And so every time I travel, I come home and she has changed the setting on the alarm clock so that it's dark. And I'm always, you know, like, what do you think? I see things in the dark? So the issue is, I'm kind of like, you know what, dear? We've been married like 35 years. Have you gotten used to this yet? No. It's just no, it just isn't going to happen. So the issue is, you can imagine, you put kids in a shelter, some like it dark, some like it lit, some need a night light, bedtimes at different times, some people need quiet, some people need ambient noise to distract them, some people like it hot, some people like it cold, and it's really hard. And if you're sleeping at someone's house, you know, the temperatures are kind of different. And I remember just over the holidays, my kids came home, they're adults, and they each have a guest room. And we discovered, I did not know this, when we turn our fan on, it turns every fan on in every room. They were all on the same frequency. Nobody tells you that when they install them. So we couldn't use them because I would turn the light on in my room and it would turn the light on in their room. That does not work. So it just, everyone was uncomfortable because everyone had a different temperature that they liked. So you need to think about how do you try and do that. The electrician has already come and fixed that, but not over the holidays. Second issue is separation and anxiety. Separation anxiety and school avoidance. Many children who have been through a difficult situation will often feel uncomfortable separating from those that they feel can protect them or those that they wish to protect. So they may be reluctant to come to school because they're going to be leaving their parents at home and something might happen to them, or they may not be able to be protected by their parents. I remember talking with one mother, and what had happened in the school was an estranged or ex-husband, I don't remember the details, came into an elementary school classroom. It was actually a full-time special ed class in an elementary school, and shot his wife in front of the class, and then shot himself. And in the process, he also shot a couple other kids too. So there was multiple deaths, and it's a full-time special ed class in an elementary school. Okay, so no big surprise. The kid that I was talking with, the mother said he didn't want to go back to school. You can understand that. But then we said, well, he needs to go back to maybe not that classroom, but to a school. Because what was happening was the school wasn't doing very much for some reason. I didn't understand why not. And so they just kept him home. And what they were doing was all the family members took one day off from work a week and just sat with him, just stayed with him. And the mother looks at me and goes, we're going to go out to the store and try and buy some workbooks so we can try and teach him. And I'm like, okay, ma'am, that's just not okay. I mean, he has an IEP, he's in a full-time special ed placement. School has to do more than that. They can't just let you keep him at home and not help. And so she said, well, they wanted him to come back to school, and I brought him and he didn't want to be there. So I looked at her and I said, well, sometimes it's also difficult for the parents to be separated from their kids after something like this. And she said, okay, I sat in the parking lot the day we tried, and I was sobbing in my car, and I couldn't leave. It's me too. And I'm like, yeah, that's what it is. So both of you need to work on that. But you have to get kids back into school or a school-like setting. Maybe just for an hour. Maybe they just sit in an office for the counselor. After the session yesterday, one of the counselors was talking with me about the kid will come and just sit with her, but she doesn't know how to get him back into a classroom. But that's the strategy. You need to be able to, you need to keep making that progress. But in many situations, out of sight is out of mind for schools. And if they're really distressed because they've had a large event that's affected everyone, they're overwhelmed. And if the kids don't show up, it's kind of easier not to deal with it. But then the kids just get worse, and eventually they come back, and they're very far behind academically and emotionally quite distressed. So the next thing is anxiety and trauma-related fears. You can understand the kids will have fears related to the trauma, something that's a trigger for them or reminds them of it. Sometimes it's things that you'll think of, sometimes it's not things that you think of, but when you talk with the person, they can tell you. I was, after the Amish schoolhouse shooting, they told me that what had happened was for some of the kids, the sound that they heard right before the door opened and the shooter came in was the sound of wheels on the driveway. It's because it's gravel. Because they don't pave driveways to Amish schoolhouses because they don't come in cars. So they don't use cars, so there's no reason to pave it. So that sound is unusual to them because they won't hear it near their house and things like that. So that was the sound that they heard, and that was a traumatic reminder for the kids, some of the kids. And so what they did was they rebuilt the schoolhouse and they paved it, paved the road. And they said to me, this is the only Amish schoolhouse in the country we know of where we've paved the road. But so you really do try and look at, okay, what's the trigger? What reminds them of it? Let's try and change that if we can. But kids can also just become more fearful, and that's the anxiety. So they can be afraid of the dark, even if the shooting happened during the daylight. So they just become scared and anxious. And that sometimes doesn't seem to make sense to them and makes them feel like they're out of control because they are not in as much control, and they are scared. As you would imagine, you have difficulties with concentration. It's not just the kids, it's the teachers too. And that leads to a deterioration in academic performance. And it also leads to a deterioration in work performance. That will be for the teachers, that will be for the administration, it will be for anyone. And I went into one school and they had one counselor. And it turned out what she was doing was locking the door of her room and sobbing. She had PTSD, she couldn't deal with the situation. The administration was like, she's not doing her job, we can't get anyone, she won't talk to anyone. And she was like, principal doesn't understand what's going on, it's really insensitive. So I had to do a lot of this shuttle diplomacy, which it only took me a day. And it was kind of like, oh no, the principal was talking how much she really worries about you and wants so much to help. I just was talking with her and then, going back and saying, oh no, the teacher, this counselor, she so much wants to help. What a dedicated counselor. But she's a little upset right now, actually a lot upset. So anyway, she took a leave of absence. We got her into treatment and they replaced her position temporarily. But the point is, people don't do their jobs well. And we've seen kids estimated to lose 2 to 3 years worth in academic stature for at least a short time period. And then you have to figure out how do you meet them where they are and move forward with them. The problem is some kids don't lose any, and some kids lose 3 years, and they don't start with the same baseline. So it's just the differentiated learning that you have to do, or differentiated teaching, is just, that always exists in a classroom, but it's like on steroids afterwards. It's just so extreme. And the real challenge, of course, is that the teachers went through the same event in most situations. So I was talking to one teacher, this was after a large mass shooting. We talked about differentiated teaching and that the kids are all going to be in different places. And she just looked at me and she said, it is difficult for me to get out of bed and come here. If I can stand in front of the class, I'm lucky. And if I can teach a single lesson to one level, I'm doing much better than I thought I could do. If you're telling me I need to start thinking about remediating some kids and advancing the lesson for others, I'm not going to be able to do that. And I looked at her and I said, no, I'm not asking you to do that. I'm saying other people will do it. So I said, look, this is a very advanced academic stature in the school. Colleges in the community want to help. Why don't you get volunteers from the college to do enrichment exercises for some of the kids? So we talked about how do you meet that need, but you have to be very creative. Kids will regress, and you're probably all familiar with developmental regression. Kids start sucking their thumb, they wet the bed, they become more clingy, even if they didn't have problems with separation before. But you also see social regression. The kids become self-centered, selfish, disinterested in the needs of others, inflexible, kind of really intolerant of change, and so do the adults. I remember talking to one superintendent, and he said, we were trying to talk about what we were going to do, and the teachers were like yelling at me, and they were really insubordinate, and I'm like, no, they're traumatized, and they're overwhelmed, and they're yelling at you because you're telling them to do something, and they can't yell at the person responsible for what happened. I think it was a natural disaster or a shooting. There isn't anything they can do about that. So you're getting that. And he said, and it just kind of said, I know they're traumatized. I just don't know what to do about it. And I'm not able to work with them. I went into one school, it was actually in Las Vegas, and it was a private school, and I was there right after the shooting happened in the concert. And the head of the school, because it was a private school, just changed the schedule to have an assembly for me to go and talk with all of the teachers and students. There was a little miscommunication. I was traveling very quickly. I actually only had about an hour to get a flight after they asked me to come there for something that was happening in a couple hours. So I was talking to someone. It was literally like 5 minutes to 5. I'm in the car in Las Vegas trying to get to something to work with people who had been in the event and were traumatized. It started in 5 minutes. I didn't know a couple hours ago I was going to be in Las Vegas. And somebody said, well, who should come? Will you come talk to the school? So I said, yes, I'll do that tomorrow. And they said, who do you want to speak to? And I just said, I don't know, whoever you'd like. I can speak to anyone there. So they took it literally. That was not what I meant. So I'm like, it's now like 5 o'clock, and they said, yeah, you're going to come here, and then they're going to have an assembly of all the students and all the teachers. And I'm like 1,000 people in an auditorium to talk about the shooting? I can't do that. That would be ridiculous. They're kids at different developmental levels. We can't talk about the children when they're there. It just would be weird. She was like, well, you said you could talk to everyone. I go, but not all at the same time. So anyway, I'm like, I'm so sorry. Maybe I wasn't clear. I don't know. I thought that was, anyway. So I was like, my apologies. So she goes, well, school's already ended. I'm not even going to be able to reach him until, so in the morning, she had to call the principal and say, or the head of the school, he's not going to do this assembly. So he canceled the assembly, and they did something in the afternoon for the teachers in different groups. But anyway, I meet with him, and he goes, and I'm going over this with him, and he goes, do you know, quite honestly, what happened was when I canceled the assembly, they all were relieved. And I go, why? And he said, they said it was so disruptive to change their schedule and make an assembly in the middle of the day on short notice. And then he looks at me and goes, we do that all the time. This is a private school. When I want to meet with them, I tell them, hey, we're all going to get together. We're a community. And he goes, but they were so inflexible. They said we weren't planning on it. And and I said, look, when people go through a crisis, they lose control. And that sense of loss of control disempowers them. And they want everything to be predictable from that point on. And any change can set something off. And he goes, yeah, I just never even thought of that. But they're just not as nimble as they used to be. Yes?
Would you say a little bit more about the kids becoming selfish or self-involved as a result of trauma? I hadn't looked at
Oh,
that
sure.
before.
So like after 9/11, I was at Yale at the time. So I was in a community that was pretty deeply impacted by it. And that was something I went over when I talked with the teachers on the first morning afterwards in one of the schools. And they said that was the most important advice, because they were getting angry with the kids. Because the kids were like, we're not going to have a test? Wow, we don't have a test. And like thousands of people died in the community near us. And they were just worried about themselves. And they get just kind of irritable and, cranky. And so people need to attend to their own needs first when they're overwhelmed before they can think of the needs of others. So they don't become generous, generally. They focus in on what they need. When something bad happens, everybody thinks, how does this affect me and those I love? What do I need to do? And they're not thinking about what other people need. And so that self-centeredness can actually be a sign that they're impacted by the trauma. And it looks like they don't care, and they're insensitive. And so they said that was very useful to know, because we realized maybe that, and my daughter came home. You have to understand, one of my daughters, her friend's mother commuted to the World Trade Center. So this was a community that was deeply impacted. And the kids were just thinking about themselves, their tests, and what was going to happen. Does this mean we can't have the game this weekend? Like, are we really not going to have a concert? I already practiced for this. You know, and they're like, thousands of people died. Like, what are you thinking about? But that's what happens, is they think about themselves, particularly when they're very young, but adults do it too. The adults just know they're not supposed to say it. But they feel the same way. So that's, you know, I remember being in the emergency room some years ago when I did more general pediatrics, and they called in to say, mother went, you know, this from the ambulance, we're bringing in a mother with a child who's non-responsive. She checked in the crib, the kid wasn't breathing, we haven't been able to resuscitate, trying CPR, we're on our way. And we'll be there, you know, ETA in 7 minutes or something. And my first reaction was, I'm going to miss dinner. I mean, that's the truth. I mean, it was just kind of like, I'm going to freaking miss dinner. The cafeteria closes in an hour. I'm not going to be able to go because I'm not going to walk out on this woman while she's sobbing. I mean, I'm sure she's going to be upset. The kid was dead, you know. It takes time to support them. And I have actually worked in the hospital where I don't usually eat breakfast, so I didn't eat breakfast. I missed lunch. I was working, so I missed dinner. The cafeteria closed at 6:30. Who closes? Anyway, we won't go into that. So I'm in the hospital until lunch the next day. No sleep, all up, 36 hours, and I didn't have a meal. And you know what? Now they put those cookies on, you know, they have the Ronald McDonald House in the hospital. You can, as a pediatric resident, get something, but those were the days when you couldn't. Like even the little peanut butter packets, no way. There was nothing. And you go and you don't eat for 36 hours and you don't sleep for 36 hours, I don't know, that's just not good. So you do think about that. It's one of the first reactions. So what I did in that situation was I kind of said, you know, I told the ER, this is going to happen, kid's going to come in, let's get staff here, get the chaplain. I'm not going to be able to go to the cafeteria. Can somebody going to dinner just pick something up? Here's $10. I don't care what it is. Just get it for me. I'll eat it later. That's what you do. You do recognize you have the needs. I mean, I'm not going to go out for dinner and leave the family waiting. But you do think about it. And I've had people say to me, how can I be a doctor and put my meals needs ahead of, you know, a family who just had a child that died?
Talking about getting the kids that have gone to this place and being insensitive, not caring, blah, 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 addressing that. What are some of the things?
So how to address it then when that happens? So I was talking with my daughter because she said to me, she was in, say, 7th, 8th grade at the time, the older one. And she said, you know, Dad, when this first happened, I was really disappointed with my peers because they were more concerned about themselves than about all these people who had died. And I thought that was just so selfish. And she said, but it's been several weeks. And to be quite honest, I'm just thinking about what I'm going to wear on Halloween. And I'm not thinking about it anymore. And I asked her why. And she said, because I actually can't do anything. I mean, I can't change what happened. I can't help the people in New York. There's no one I can help here about it. And she looked at me, she said, do you realize that they were doing this fundraiser. So this isn't a political statement, but President Bush had decided, well, I don't know that he decided, but it was presented that it came from the president, that children of the United States should collect pennies to give to the children in Afghanistan. And my reaction was kind of like, why? They don't use American cash, and why would we send them pennies? I mean, that's got to be incredibly expensive and stupid. I know you could exchange it for larger currency, but that's a lot of effort. And I don't know, why don't we just not drop a bomb on them in the first place, and then we don't need to send them the cash to repair what we've done. That becomes a political statement, but I thought, just one less bomb. That's all the kids are going to collect, is the cost of that bomb. Just take it out of the defense budget, just send it as a wire transfer. Anyway, and so she said, so Dad, we're collecting pennies, and they asked for a volunteer in class, and I volunteered, and they picked someone else. And she looked at me and she goes, can you imagine something that makes you feel less meaningful than not being allowed to collect the change that people discard? And I just paused, I go, no, dear, I can't think of something that would make you feel less meaningful than that. So she said, there's nothing I can do, so I don't want to think about it, because it's only upsetting and I can't help. So as it turned out, I had been asked to give a presentation at the American Academy of Pediatrics meeting in 2 weeks. I had to prepare it that weekend. It was a Saturday night. I was a little overwhelmed by being asked to do this on short notice, for thousands of people. And because then she looked at me and she said, Dad, you're lucky because you get to help people. And I said, well, dear, I know sometimes I can help people, but actually I don't feel effective at either. So like in Connecticut, we had many families who experienced losses. And so the governor had made this decision. We were going to set up a recovery center at Ground Zero for Connecticut citizens, and we needed to train up the mental health staff. So on the first weekend, I was there with someone else. Someone was going to do adults, I was going to do kids, and we were going to train the mental health staff that were in the state government so that they could go to Ground Zero and help these families. So I had to put this all together, went and we were doing it, and while we're doing it, we get a call. The governor has decided they're not going to have a recovery center at Ground Zero. I'm like, seriously, it's Sunday. We're training all these people for what? Like what did we tell them? Now, they actually set up a system for behavioral disaster response. It's a model that's been used nationally. They started that training that day, and they responded to Sandy Hook and other crisis events. So it wasn't a waste of time, but at the time, it felt that way. So I looked at my daughter and I go, I've gone through this too, where I've tried things and they failed, and I haven't helped. And she said, but at least you can try. I can't even do that. And so you're lucky. So I had to write the talk, and I didn't know what to say. And I also wanted to support my daughter, and I thought that was more important. So I kind of put them together, and I said, dear, can I use that in my presentation and tell the pediatricians that they should feel lucky based on what you just told me? And she said, well, will that help the pediatricians feel better? And I go, yes, dear. You have given the inspiration to help the pediatricians of the country. She goes, then I want you to say it. And I'm like, good. 2 things checked off the list. Chance I'll go to bed on time. So the issue is, and then she felt empowered, like she had helped.
Figure out something to do.
Yeah, so we can talk about commemoration later if you wish. We tend to do more days of service because we feel that if kids can help others, that is how they will help themselves. So that's just, in general, when kids are feeling like they're disempowered, they don't recover as well. Yes?
How much is this, how much longer does it cause an adjustment period when they're already facing a lifetime of personal trauma from the way they've been brought up in their home, and then they're hit with this mega trauma, if you will?
Okay, so the question had to do really, what about children who have pre-existing or ongoing trauma and loss? I'm going to add loss. Those children are worse off, just put it that way. Individuals who have, and I'll go over this, when you've had pre-existing trauma or loss, it tends to resurface during these events. Individuals who have been through these events, if they've learned to cope with them, may have become resilient. But with chronic trauma and recurrent loss, they usually are not coping with it if it's repetitive. I was in one community known for its gang violence. I won't say which one because I don't like to be critical of communities, but I was talking to a group of educators, and I was talking about cumulative loss and that kids don't get used to it. They just get used to the fact that adults won't help them with it, so they stop asking for help. So they give the appearance they don't need it because they don't ask for it because they know they're not going to get it. So they tend to turn to peers for it. That's actually the reason why some kids join gangs, is to protect themselves. And it's also what we call reactive risk-taking and counterphobic behavior. If individuals are afraid they're going to die of gun violence because they're in a community known for gun violence, they see it as inevitable, some of them. And so what they need to do is to deal with that fear. They need to place themselves in the situation they fear most to prove that they will survive it. So they go into situations of gun violence thinking, well, if I just do this, it'll keep me safe, and then they survive, and that gives them some reassurance. But the problem is some of them die, and then it is not counterphobic behavior and reactive risk-taking is not a good thing. The problem with it is what adults then do is say that these kids feel invulnerable, so we have to tell them that they're more vulnerable, so they heighten the anxiety more through fear-based tactics, and that increases the counterphobic behavior and the reactive risk-taking, and it's just a spiral downward. So as I was going through this, somebody in the audience just said, "You don't understand our community. You don't live here." And I said, "No, I don't live here. I don't pretend to know your community well, but what doesn't seem to make sense to you from what I've said?" And he said, "Here, it's just normal for kids to be in gangs." And I said, and then he looked at me and he goes, "It's normal here for children to murder other children." And I just said, it's not normal for children to murder children anywhere. I don't need to live in that community. Because once you say it's normal, it means you don't have to do anything about it. And I'm not okay with that. And I don't think any of us should be okay with that. I can't imagine what it's like to live in that community where you see it and you don't feel you can stop it. But we can never give up on that. You know, that's just a given to me, which is the reason why I never refer to, after major disasters and shootings, that we've reached a new normal. Because, you know, it just implies it's okay. And I don't think it is. And so there's a certain, I told him that, and he looked at me and he goes, "You don't understand. You're not from here." And I was like, "No, I'm not. We've established that." He wouldn't stop arguing with me. The rest of the group was like telling him to stop talking. We want to go on with the workshop. And I didn't feel like I could. I actually had to stop. And I said, "We're going to take our break." There was no break planned. We took a break, and then it just, I let him think about it, and he came up to me and apologized. And he said, "You know what? I just don't know what to do. This isn't okay. Could you start up again? We have to figure out what to do." So I think the issue is when you're constantly confronted by loss and crisis among the children who you care about, it's just not tolerable for most adults. And so they will either start saying, "I think they're okay," when they're not. I went to one of the earlier presentations that I did when I was in training. I was asked to go to a school. 3 of the children had experienced the death of, actually I think it was more than 3. A teacher came up to me, she taught 3rd, 4th grade, and she said, "Over half of my kids have had deaths this year." And I'm thinking, oh, that's probably an exaggeration. It wasn't. She actually didn't even know about all of them. And so there was a lot of gang violence in that community. And so I went in and I talked with the kids, but I called to the school social worker a week before I was there, and I said, "Could you do me a favor? I'm going to be coming in to talk to these children. I don't know these children. I'm just a guest. I think it would be good if you came with me so you could follow up with these kids. And I also think it would be great if you could talk to these 3 children beforehand." One child, his uncle at like 23, was killed on a train track. Another had a father who killed himself. Another had someone who died of some catastrophic illness. They were all horrible, immediate tragedies that had happened for the 3 that I mentioned. It turned out there were others that the teacher didn't even know about. And I came the next week, at the scheduled time. I went to her office first, and she was with a child doing some counseling for their weekly IEP, indicated counseling session. And I was really struck by the fact she said to me while the kid was there, because I had to interrupt, and she just said, "I'm in the middle of a session." And I said, "Well, will you be able to join me?" And she said, "No, I have more important things to do." And I'm like, "Okay, did you talk to the children that I asked you to?" And she said, "No, I was too busy." And I'm thinking, what's more important if you're a social worker in a school, in an elementary school, than to talk to a child whose father killed himself? Like, I know there are other kids with needs, but that one should be pretty high on the list. It was a week. You'd think she could find it. And then I said, "Well, I'm sorry to hear that." And she looked at me and she just said, she wouldn't let the kid leave because she did not want to have this conversation with me. And she just said, "You don't understand. If I come in and I ask these children to talk to me, they'll want to talk to me again." And I felt like saying, but that's a good thing. But it wasn't. She was so overwhelmed. There was just so much loss and crisis, and she just didn't feel like she could deal with it. And so when you have those situations, those kids don't do better, is the bottom line. So we really have to work. You know, we talk about a lot of these events where you never thought it would happen. I was in some congressional briefing the day before the March for Our Lives in Washington, and I just kind of said, you know, we talk about the fact that we're shocked it would happen in a place like Parkland, Florida. And it is shocking, and that's horrible. But we should be asking ourselves why we aren't shocked when it happens any place. And so we have to start thinking about how these kids who are multiply traumatized and have cumulative loss, they are actually the most vulnerable. And one of the things I found most, just as a commentary, from talking to or watching some of the presentations from some of the activists from Parkland, is that it's probably the first time I've seen people come up after a major crisis event and talk about the needs of others. So if you saw the March for Our Lives, the majority of the speakers were from inner city, minority communities, and the kids from Parkland said, we understand we come from privilege, and that makes it easier for us. We need to think about how hard it is for them. And they deal with something like this all the time. And they not only shared the stage with them, but they invited them and they showcased them. So that's what I think makes it unusual, because people usually after a crisis become very self-centered. It's like, understand what's happened to me, no one's been through this. You need to help me, and they are instead thinking about how to improve things in the country. So we can talk about why that is, but in answer to your question, cumulative loss, chronic trauma is not helpful. It just puts you in a bad place in most situations. I will get into later post-traumatic growth. There are some exceptions where people learn coping skills and become more resilient, and that helps them for future loss, but not if there are so many of them. They just get overwhelmed. Yes?
You were talking about empowering students, and as a counselor, some of the things I struggle with is making people more aware or having knowledge of trauma symptoms and adjustments. And so I was wondering if you might be able to help me by giving like a brief idea of how do you share this with teachers who see kids acting out and think they're being defiant, or that they don't have a reason to cry all the time. How do you help them understand that they're experiencing trauma?
Okay. So I'm going to get into this in a little while. Actually, it's on the next slide that many of the kids are experiencing trauma, but I also think they're experiencing other things. And I think we've gone a little too far of becoming trauma-informed, which suggests that's all you need to be informed about. But you do need to be informed about trauma, and we do that. I remember somebody talking with me, and I said something like, I got like an announcement for trauma-informed yoga. Like, I don't even know, what does that mean? Like, it's about mindfulness. Like, how is that different if you're trauma-informed? They go, oh, it's a thing. And I go, oh, I know it's a thing, but I'm asking what thing is it? And they looked at me and they said, like, for example, if you were a trauma instructor, you wouldn't just grab someone and put them in a pose, because you would realize maybe they had been traumatized by someone and you're trauma-informed. And I go, I would never grab anyone anyway. It's a violation of their space. I mean, maybe it's trauma, maybe they just don't like being touched. I mean, there are many reasons not to grab someone. So I said, okay, that's a point. But this was a flyer to come to an 8-week trauma-informed. That's just a point, which I would think they would just know. What else? And she goes, well, that's pretty much it. And I'm like, then it's not trauma-informed yoga. It's just that the teacher isn't a jerk. I mean, and we don't say that. You know, come here, our teachers are not jerks. We talk to people before we grab them. And I'm being a little sarcastic, but that's about what they said, and I didn't think that deserved a whole title. So anyway, going back, so I'm not one of these people that, I've been asked by state departments of education to come in and share trauma-informed curricula, and I go, it's a buzzword. Okay, there isn't a trauma-informed curricula. There are good curricula. And they should be informed by trauma, but they have to be informed by loss. They have to be informed by attachment theory, child development, social emotional learning. There's a lot of things you have to be informed about. So anyway, how do I then get the point across? Because it's a good question. Part of it is I tell them what they can do. So a lot of times they don't know what to do because there's a tendency in the whole trauma-informed movement to tell people that trauma is bad and that adversity causes adverse outcomes. And I'm kind of like, I don't know. I think people know that, particularly when they live in these communities. So they may appear insensitive, it's because they just really don't know what to do about it. But they know that kids who have been traumatized are having trouble. So then people go, yes, but it's the brain research, and we're really helping them understand that there are changes in your brain after you've been through a traumatic event, and it records it. And I'm like, I think that's important research that's being done. It helps us think through different strategies and approaches for treatment. But to be quite honest, when I was in elementary school, I knew that the only way you could remember something was that there was a synaptic change in your brain. Otherwise, you wouldn't remember it. So I always knew in principle that you had to make a change in your brain in order to record a memory. So that's just kind of a given. But if people don't really understand the mechanism on a neurophysiological level or whatever, I don't know that that really helps them to go into it on MRIs or something. Like, what I think the staff really need to know in the administration is, what do you do about it? What are the strategies and approaches that you can help people who have been through this? So I'm all for helping people understand more about the impact of trauma. That's why I go over it. And what can you do, which is what I will go over next. But what I find is that when I do that, then I don't get the resistance. If you can help people understand what to do, they want to do it. And that there's a tendency for them to say, it's not my problem, or I don't think it's happening, because they really don't know what to do. And so every once in a while, people will say, yeah, I went to one school after a mass shooting, and they were like, we think the kids are okay. They're over it. And I'm like, it's been like 3 weeks. Like, that would be surprising. They're generally not over it. And it really was that they didn't know what to do. And one of the staff came up to me and handed me a pile of letters that she had the kids write, knowing that I think because I was coming. And basically the letters said things like, I watched my friend get shot and killed in the face, and the school just keeps giving me more homework. What's going on here? They don't understand what I've been through. So I'm reading through these letters right before I meet with the administration, and they're saying, I think they're pretty much okay. And I'm like, that would be surprising. And sometimes I'm a little bit more direct. And I can get away with that in most circumstances because I don't report to them. And I'm also invited in. So I can be a little bit, I don't want to, there was one school district I went to, and they had gone through a massive natural disaster, and they got a lot of displaced kids, and their community was quite overwhelmed by it. And I showed up. It was right before the school year started, and it wasn't that long after the disaster. And I don't know how to put it. This was years ago, and the superintendent was talking about she was going on vacation in a couple weeks out of the country, and everybody was like having fun, meeting with each other. And I said, well, how much time do I have to talk? And they go, can you keep it to like 30 minutes or so? There was no recognition of what was going on. I mean, there was just this complete denial. And I don't think they had any sense of what was happening in their community. And that's probably the most direct I've ever been. I'm not proud of this. I probably shouldn't be taping this. And I just kind of said, I just came to the school system. I see you're all excited to be back with your friends and, really looking forward to things that you have in front of you that are exciting. And I said, take a couple more minutes to say hello to each other, because if you don't deal with this, I predict half of you will leave the school system by the end of the year. And they just looked at me like, what? And I go, you have to realize what you're in right now. And you're going to have a lot of issues. And I really need you to focus on that, because otherwise you're not going to be prepared for what these kids need and the impact it's going to have on you. And then there was just this quiet. Now, I've not ever done that since, and I hadn't done it before, but every once in a while I kind of feel like someone's in denial. And I will tell you, I have been in situations where a particular leader is not dealing with it, like totally closed off. I went to one school, They had had a suicide pact with the students. One had shot himself in the head, was on life support. I drafted up a letter for them to send out, and they just said, oh, we were advised not to send the letter for liability issues. I go, pardon? And they're like, yeah, legal office consulted, and they said, we'd be making ourselves liable. And I said, for sending out the letter? And I said, what about the liability when the next kid tries to kill himself? Like, that would seem to be I'm not an attorney, but I would think you'd feel liable, at least. And they were like, well, it's not really our problem, it's the parents' problem, and stuff like that. And then I said something like, well, you have one kid who has died, and he goes, no, he's not dead, he's on life support. And I go, oh, we're really getting a little into the details here. I mean, they're talking about withdrawing his life support. He shot himself in the head. It's not a good situation. And so we kind of had this sense, I won't go through the whole story, but there was just this level of resistance. And so I finally took one of the leaders off the campus and just talked with them, and they just said, I can't talk about this. I had a parent who killed themselves. And I can't talk about this. And then said, but if a kid dies because I can't talk about it, I can't live with that. And then went back and told all the staff. I didn't ask the person to do that, but in a staff meeting, told the person. They were all crying. It was very emotional. And they then did a wonderful response. But they didn't before. So sometimes when I see resistance, it usually isn't because the person doesn't realize it's a problem, and it's usually not because they don't care about kids or they wouldn't be in that position. It's usually because they don't know what to do, they're overwhelmed by the responsibility, they're struggling themselves, and so I actually try and take more of a clinical approach to support that person and move them toward action. So I may become slightly confrontational, but usually I'm just a lot more supportive, and it's kind of, hey, help me understand a little bit. What are you thinking? And then I've had just a lot of people open up and tell me why they haven't been able to do it. But they can do that to me because I'm not in the system. I don't report to them. They don't report to me. Everything they say to me is confidential. There's no judgment. So I'm in a slightly different place. It's hard when that's your superintendent, your principal, your clinical supervisor. Other questions? What? Okay, so let me go on to some of the symptoms. You can also see sadness and depression, as you would expect, and you can see substance use, new onset, or an increase in substance use. Tobacco, alcohol, other substance use. So when you do a recovery plan after a disaster, you need to make sure you're attending to evaluation and treatment of substance use problems. And then you'll get somatizations. Individuals often present with physical symptoms when they're psychologically distressed and they don't see the connection, so you have to help them with that. But I will also say that stress-related health problems increase after traumatic events as well. So you will see an increase in hypertension and hypertension-related problems like heart attacks. You'll see an increase in diabetes poorly managed, an increase in asthma attacks. So really from the psychophysiological reactions from stress hormones. So you see both, and that's why we work a lot with school nurses, because they see all of that, and they're already pretty short-staffed and pretty overwhelmed by the rest of their position beforehand. So I'm going to just spend a minute on this next point, and then we'll take a break, because attending to your basic needs is important. I already mentioned some of the concerns that I have if we look just at the post-traumatic reactions, but we do need to look at post-traumatic stress disorder. It does go up significantly after these events, and I want you to understand some of the basic issues in PTSD. To have PTSD, you have to have been exposed to a traumatic event, and that's defined as either exposure to death, serious injury, or sexual violence. And for children, they either need to be a direct victim, they were in a car accident and they were injured, or they need to be a witness of that event, or they need, for children, they can be informed that it happened to a close family member or friend. So that means a kid who's told their parent died in a car accident a week ago out of state now can meet the exposure criteria, and that is relatively new. And I think what's going to happen then is a lot of kids who are having other adjustment difficulties may appear to be having a post-traumatic stress disorder, when they actually are having something different. So the example I'm going to use is a child whose parent dies in a car accident. So they have to have symptoms for at least 30 days, for 1 month. That's the only way you can diagnose post-traumatic stress disorder. You can have an acute stress reaction or reactions. But reactions after traumatic events are so common that we really wait for them to persist at least 30 days before we classify it as a disorder. But we don't wait for 30 days before we give support. So I don't want you to think that you just say, well, everybody has stress reactions, and so I heard you had to wait 30 days. You have to wait 30 days before you can call it PTSD. But please don't wait to help the kid. So they have to have symptoms in all 4 of these areas. So the first is re-experiencing of the traumatic event. That could be through recurrent, intrusive, distressing memories or dreams. But in children, they don't have to remember the content of the dreams. So they can just have these scary dreams, which children who are grieving the death of a parent will do. So they don't even have to tell you it's about a car accident or anything, just that they're having scary dreams. Children aren't required to have the dissociative reactions, those flashbacks that are more common in adults. And they may also demonstrate the re-experiencing through playing out the scenario. That's called post-traumatic play. There is an assumption by some people that when kids are playing, they are recovering. But in post-traumatic play, they're actually resensitizing. So we can talk about that, but just keep in mind, just because it's in play doesn't mean it's good. So in post-traumatic play, they may show their re-experiencing by acting it out. So, as an example, there were these 2 kids, they were watching the fireworks. They were sitting on a windowsill. The younger child fell off the windowsill and died. So the sister started playing funeral, and she would take a box and put a doll in it, dig a hole and bury it, and then she would get very upset, and she'd dig it up, and then she'd put the doll in the box, and she would bury it, and then she'd dig it up, and she just kept doing it. It has a ritualistic characteristic. It tends to draw other people in. We can talk more if you're interested in post-traumatic play, but you wouldn't just observe that and say, look, she's playing. She's getting over that. Or she doesn't talk about it, so I don't know that she's re-experiencing. That actually is an example of re-experiencing. So that's one group of symptoms. The second is avoidance of stimuli associated with the trauma. They don't want to think or talk about it. Avoidance is a required criteria in PTSD. So it doesn't happen some of the time. It needs to happen to be part of PTSD. And so if you are going to go and ask for help, you have to think and talk about it. So a lot of individuals who have post-traumatic reactions and PTSD are therefore reluctant to bring it to other people's attention. So you have to ask. You don't always have to do formalized screening, but you can. But you have to at least ask about it. Otherwise, they often won't come forward. But yes?
Sorry, kind of going back a little post-traumatically. So if you see the kid or the adult, the kid reenacting that play, the burial thing, would that be considered necessarily a good thing or a regress?
So if it's post-traumatic play and they're re-experiencing it and the play leads them to become more and more distressed, then it's not adaptive to them. There is play that can be, you can have therapeutic play where the child reenacts the scenario in play, but often there's a resolution that occurs through the therapeutic intervention. So I had one child, his father died of cancer through home hospice. His mother was a social worker. I've met few people who I thought were just like better mothers, and she just was incredible. She was so sweet, she was so nice. She did home hospice for her husband. Later I'm going to say I've met 2 or 3 situations where there wasn't guilt. She was one of them. She was like, I loved him deeply. I did everything I could. I don't feel guilty. Should I feel guilty? No, she shouldn't feel guilty, and she didn't. She was wonderful. So the kid, then she also met, and she was also so calming, and the kid had some other issues beforehand, some language problems and stuff. And so she comes to bring him to me. He's like 5 or somewhere around 5. And then I said, any other stressors? And she goes, well, we did have this one situation where there was some problem with the electrical wires, and they had one of those like transformers right near the side of their house for the, I didn't understand all of it, but apparently the electricity went backwards, and so it kind of, the electrical current kind of flooded their house. And so what happened was the light bulbs exploded in all the rooms, and then the tree outside set on fire right near the transformer and stuff like that. And it upset the kid. Yeah, and so, but the way she said it to me is like, yeah, the light bulbs kind of exploded. And I'm like, that's like horrible. And she was like, it was upsetting. She was just wonderful. I mean, she wasn't, but she tells me about that. So the kid was acting this stuff out in play, and he took the trucks. He had language, his language was not clear, so it was a little hard to talk to him too. So he would take trucks and cars, and the daddy would be in trouble, and the ambulance would come and pick him up, and there were fire trucks. That's why I mentioned the fire that got worked into the theme, and the fire trucks would come, and at first they didn't come in time, and the dad died. And then what happened after 1 or 2 sessions, it actually went pretty quickly, I think in large part because of the mother. Then the trucks would come, but they'd come in time, and they'd get him to the hospital, and he would be okay. And then sometimes they were fire trucks, but sometimes they were delivery trucks. And then he was like, I don't really need to play with the trucks. And then he would play with something else. So he worked it out through play. And so that was helpful to him. But if he was stuck repeating it, that would not have been. So as I was saying, the avoidance, the key part is you need to look for it. But kids avoid talking about deaths too. So that's not going to discern between the two, bereavement and trauma. You also will see negative alterations in cognitions and mood. I'll go into this after the break more when I talk more about bereavement, is that they may have a distorted sense of their responsibility because they don't understand the causality well and feel guilty. They may also have intense anger or other moods, but you see that in bereavement as well, and it's just so common after these events. And then the last is increased arousal, which may be difficulty concentrating or sleeping, irritability or anger, and self-destructive behavior, which you see commonly in bereavement as well, even when there is no actual traumatic element to it. And you can see hypervigilance or exaggerated startle. So the point I wanted to end with before we take the break is there's a wide range of reactions and concerns, and it's not just PTSD or trauma symptoms. It may actually be, in a particular case, bereavement. So I remember talking to one young adult who was a teenager, and he was in a community shooting, and the person on either side of him was shot and killed, but he was not injured. He came to school once and stayed for an hour, and otherwise he would not come into school. He declined all counseling and stayed home mainly, according to the school. So we went and visited him in his home, and he looked at me and he said, I said, why aren't you getting counseling? And he said, they just want to talk about the shooting, and I don't want to talk about that anymore. It's not helping me. And he said, look, I had some trauma symptoms for a week. I didn't sleep, I was jittery, I startled easily. I know that's what you get with trauma, and I had that. But I'm sleeping fine now, and I'm not scared, and I'm not jittery. And I looked at him and I said, well, why don't you leave your house? And he goes, I leave my house every day. Why does everyone assume I'm not leaving my house? I'm not going to school, but I'm leaving my house. I go to meet with my friends who were there at the time of the shooting. They understand what I went through, and I want to be with them. And I said, and then he looks at me and he goes, I'm going camping this weekend with them. We're not scared. I don't know why everyone assumes we're scared. And then I said, well, then why aren't you in school? And he said, well, it didn't feel right to be there without her. Well, the person on either side of him was shot and killed. Well, on one side was his girlfriend that he planned on marrying, and she was dead. And he said it didn't feel right to be in school without her. So I looked at him and I said, well, maybe you're grieving the death of your girlfriend. And he looked surprised, which I thought was unusual. He looked surprised and he just said, that's it. And if someone wants to talk to me about that, I'll go for counseling now. I just don't want to keep talking about the shooter. And so the issue is in these situations, if you have a soul trauma focus, there's even some thinking in that field, and I had this mentioned at a meeting quite recently, you don't even have to think of bereavement for the first couple weeks, because trauma trumps bereavement. And sometimes it does for individuals, but not always. And so the issue is, sometimes what you need to do is call a place like this and get them that bereavement support, because that's actually their primary need. And so sometimes it's bereavement, but sometimes it's not either of those. It's the secondary losses and stressors. Because when these things happen, usually other bad things follow. And so if you have large-scale fires, for example, wildfires, kids have to relocate, they lose their peer network, they have academic failure in their new schools, they have to integrate into new social networks. families are unemployed or underemployed, if their businesses are impacted by changes in tourism or a lot of people moving out of the area, so there isn't as much need for services for the people who remain. And then that causes parental stress and mental health problems in the adults and marital conflict and domestic violence. And so what tends to happen is you get this one horrible event and everyone focuses on that, and they don't realize that the trauma and loss isn't over. It's all these things that follow. So the last story I'm going to say, and then I promise I will give you a break, was I was in Sonoma County after the wildfires there, and I was talking to a group of pediatricians, and they said, you know, we ask our patients when they come in if their home was destroyed. That's our screening question. And I said, that's a good question. Please continue. But understand that's not everything. So I tell them a story of one of the teachers in New Orleans after Katrina. She was living in the French Quarter, and she was renting. And she said her home had no damage, no wind damage, no flooding, because the French Quarter didn't flood that much. And she said, but what happened was about 3 months later, my lease ran out, and the rent was doubled because there wasn't enough housing in the area, so you could get more money. So the landlord doubled the rent, and she couldn't afford it on her salary as a school employee. So she said there wasn't any place else nearby to move, so I had to move about 45 minutes away, and I'm pretty much living out of the trunk of my car at this point. She said the real problem, though, was I had to pull my daughter out of high school because she couldn't stay there because we didn't live there anymore. And so she's now in another school system, and she got really depressed from that. So I ended up putting her on antidepressants through an emergency room visit, but we really couldn't get counseling. I'm sure there wasn't access, cost was probably an issue, transportation. And then, so that wasn't really doing it. She was still very upset. So someone said, get her a dog. That's, you know, help her with that. So she got a dog, and the dog attacked someone in the throat, and she said, I'm going to court next week, and my attorney says there's a good chance I'll be bankrupt in a week. So her house was fine. She didn't have any problem that day, but her whole life was very disrupted afterwards. So it is not just the event, it's everything that follows the event. And in some situations that extends for years. And that, it can be the same thing. You diagnose cancer, family member goes into hospice, parent has to take some time off, they lose their job, it causes financial problems, one of the other kids gets depressed, and it's just this cascade. And it's not just the diagnosis, it's not just the death, it's all the stressors that are associated with it. So having said that, let me give you a break. Can we come back really in 5 minutes? I'm going to start in 10 minutes, but for like real in 10 minutes. If we could do that, that would be really good. And some of those events can also be traumatic, and some of them can be around loss or other kind of disruptions. What makes it even more confusing that it's not just the event that had happened and what follows, it's everything that preceded the event. So there is a tendency for when you've had a crisis event to uncover prior crisis or loss. So I went to one school, there had been an accidental shooting, it was an elementary school, young child found a gun, discharged it, and shot and killed another child. And I was talking to the teachers about how to support the kids around this. And one of the teachers just started sobbing, and we had to stop the session and provide her comfort. And so she disclosed to her peers for the first time that she had miscarried. She had miscarried 20 years prior and hadn't discussed that before. So when these events happen, we often see how we're connected to them. So when I'm telling you things, you're probably thinking about something that's happened in your life, or maybe it's just someone you work with, a child that you work with in whatever your position is, but it may also be something that's happened to you yourself, or a family member or someone you care about. And that is what we do, is we become more kind of inward directed. I don't know that I like calling it self-centered because that sounds critical, but we do think about ourselves and those we care about when we hear these things. And so you have to recognize that when you go in and you try and deal with one event, you're not dealing with one event. You're dealing with everything that followed and everything that preceded. And if you're doing crisis response work, you have to be sensitive to that. So there's kind of two take-homes on that. I went to one school one of the teachers was discovered to have been having sex with one of the students. I think it was a high school or junior high. And so that teacher was removed, but it hit the papers, and that was a big crisis for the school. So when I met with the principal, I said, well, you know, one of the things you need to think about has to do with whether there are other people who have had any sexual victimization in the past, whether it's assault or another form of victimization. It's probably going to be more the adults in the system than the children, just because they've lived longer and had more opportunity for these negative experiences. And statistically, it's probably more the women than the men, but it's the men as well. And so I said you might want to be reminding your staff about employee assistance programs and where they can call if they need a hotline to talk with someone, you know, what's a rape hotline number that you can use in your community. And the principal just looked at me and was like, oh, please tell me I don't have to start talking to the teachers about whether they were sexually assaulted, and as in the past. And I said, no, you don't have to, but you would just help them if you did. Again, this is your choice. And he goes, no, I will do it. And I came back like the next day or a couple days later, and he just looked at me and he goes, 3 who've already told me. And I would have never thought of that. So you have to think of those things. You have to realize that you talk about one event, and these other things come to the surface, and they can be related, or they can be completely unrelated. And it catches you off guard because it has nothing to do in any way that you can imagine with what just happened, except it was something that was frightening, overwhelming, or was a loss experience or a trauma. And that's what they're thinking about. So you would imagine then everyone's upset, but they don't look to be. So a lot of times parents and teachers tend to underestimate the distress of kids because they're not visible, their distress, most of the time. They tend to withhold their concerns because they don't want to complain about it, because it makes them feel that they're abnormal if they share what they see as symptoms of a problem, or they're trying to protect their parents who are upset. And if adults communicate that this is something not to talk about because it makes them uncomfortable, then they don't talk about it. And you know, this happens all the time with a death. When kids talk about it, it bothers people, and as a result, the kids learn they shouldn't talk about it, and that's with strangers, but it's also with their family. Same thing happens after crisis situations. My youngest daughter was in 4th grade when 9/11 happened, and she was in a school that went kindergarten to 4th grade. And the school decided, and her mother's friend commuted to the World Trade Center, and so the school was very deeply impacted, and we can go into why, but the school decided not to talk about it. So they didn't even inform the children it happened. You have to understand this happens in a community very close, and the kids didn't, so my daughter, who was in 4th grade, did not find out about it until she got home after school, and she was home alone with her sister, and her older sister had to tell her. That's not a good thing. The principal made a mistake, and she called me that night, and she said, I made a mistake. I didn't know what to say, so we didn't say anything. So we blocked all incoming messages and visitors, and we didn't tell them. And we need to undo that. So I've told the teachers to come in for an in-service before school tomorrow, and I'm hoping you will speak, because I don't have a presenter otherwise. So I went in and talked with them, and they did the right thing, and they did a wonderful job. My daughter was in 4th grade, just said to me later, she said that day, I knew something was going on because the teachers were hugging each other. I just didn't know what was going on. Now that's very frightening. When you see your adults upset and you don't even know why, it makes you feel very unstable. So then she said to me, I guess this is something they're not comfortable talking about. I will never speak about it in school. Now, she had a wonderful 4th grade teacher, the same teacher she had for 3rd grade, and she was probably the best teacher she's ever had, either of my children have had. And I said, you could talk to her about anything. And she said, no, it's very clear it's uncomfortable, and I would never do something to make my teachers uncomfortable. I will never mention it in school. And she never did. And I said, dear, that's not healthy. And she said, it's okay, Dad. I can talk to you and Mom and my sister, and that's all I really need. So I'm okay, but I will not do that with him. I remember she came home one day and she said, we just had a Scholastic book sale. It was like 4 months later, and she said, and I was looking at some of the books. They had one book about 9/11, and it had pictures of people jumping out of the towers and, collapsing and people sobbing. There's some kids here who are going to be really deeply impacted by that, and they just had the book mixed in with the other books. I don't think they were really thinking. And I said, did you tell them? And she goes, no, Dad, I don't talk about it in school. They don't want me to talk about it. So, I mean, it was just kind of like, but you have good insights, dear, but she wasn't going to talk about it. So, but parents may also be aware, but not think the professionals are interested, or assume that it's, I don't know if people have heard, it's just a normal reaction to an abnormal event. It's a way to try and normalize some of the reactions, but I think that it pretty much says, if you're having this problem, just suck it up and deal with it, because everyone else has. I don't think it really encourages people to accept help. So the way I phrase it, which is just a little bit different, is even psychologically healthy individuals, such as yourself, when they find themselves in situations such as this, may experience significant distress. And fortunately, we have someone that can help you with that. Do I have your permission to invite them in to talk with you? That's just much better than, as a physician, just saying, well, everyone has that. It's just a normal reaction. Do you think you need counseling? They just say no. And so I think we have to be a little bit more nuanced about the way we express that. Because there's stigma related to mental illness, and it doesn't go away after a major disaster. So let me go in through some of the stages. If you think of this as coping over time, and we have a baseline from point A to B, and it is not a straight line. So individuals will have good events that occur where they are coping better than their baseline, a little better than their baseline, and they will have times when they are in distress, something bad has happened. But they return back to their baseline without outside intervention or support. And that's the difference between being in distress and being in crisis. So a crisis event is not defined by the event. It is defined by the individual or the system's or group's capacity to recover from the event without external support. So if you see someone who's in distress, there's a tendency to say they're in crisis, and that is not necessarily accurate. So you shouldn't judge this because someone's distressed that they are overwhelmed by it. They are affected by it. And if you see someone who can cope and is resilient and can deal with it, you should not withhold support because you think they can cope with it. So if you have a colleague who is doing really well and they just had a spouse die, and you go, well, they seem to be coping, I don't want to bother them, that is not a good decision because they're in probably a great deal of distress and would really appreciate some additional support so they don't have to struggle as much. But let's say there is a situation where a crisis event has occurred at point B and it has overwhelmed the resources or the capacity of the individual or system to recover without external support. And then people feel vulnerable, and at point D, their usual coping mechanisms have failed. They are in crisis. And at this point, outside support generally comes in. If it's an individual crisis and no one knows that it's happened to you, then no, it doesn't. But in these major events, there's enough people who know what's going on, and support comes in. Now, I was in New York City on one of the trips after 9/11, and it was several months after 9/11, several months after September 11th, and it was in the middle of the anthrax scares. And I was actually talking to a patient over the phone on the weekend or something, and I don't remember the circumstance, and the patient said, you're going into New York City a lot, you're working with New York City schools, and I said, yes, and she said, did you hear what happened on the plane today? You know, about some concern about anthrax release, and she said, please take care of yourself. So here's a patient's family telling me that they're worried about me. Then I get to New York City, and the cab driver, I get a cab at the airport, and I'm going to the hotel, and the cab driver looks at me and he says, do you have any duct tape? So my initial reaction was, the engine is falling apart, and I'm supposed to provide duct tape to this driver. You know, like, it's good to be in New York City. I grew up on Long Island, so I love the city. So I'm like, no, I'm sorry, I didn't bring duct tape. And he goes, okay, let me tell you what to do. As soon as I drop you off at your hotel, go out and get some duct tape. Then I need you to seal the doors, and so that it keeps out if any anthrax is released, it'll keep it from coming into your hotel room. And so you need to go do that. So I'm sitting there. I was on the anthrax working group. But by the way, you don't do that. It's not good advice. Like, why would I go to New York City and lock myself in a hotel room and seal it off? Like, obviously, I would have to leave for food, water, you know, for the reason why I'm in New York City. And the air system, that wouldn't do anything to the air system. Anyway, so it's not good advice, all right? I'm going to say that from the beginning. But it was the first and last time that a taxi driver in New York City was ever checking on making sure I was okay. It was chilling. I will tell you, it was very chilling. And it was kind of like, oh my God, you care about me. And that's what you got everywhere. was people were talking to you more. They were like, okay, can I help you with anything? This is horrible, how are you doing? You saw signs up of all the pictures of people that were missing. Everyone was trying to figure out where they were. It just was a different space. And that's what you see after these events. This sense of community, coming together, sharing, that normally doesn't occur. And so people do refer to it as the honeymoon period. And I always say, I don't use that term because that suggests that marriage is a crisis. And so it's just not, there is a whole issue around messaging and wording, which I'll say. So I don't call it that. But it is a time where people come together. And I say to them, look, because I'm often in the communities at that point, and I said, look, if there's something that's really good that's happening, figure out what that is, make a commitment to continue it. Because after this event is over, people tend to go back to the disengagement. And if that cohesion gave you support now, it's something you want to continue. So it's a legacy that you can carry forward from the event. But you need to institutionalize it. You need to have the structure to make sure that it continues. So then people start to recover. And when they start to recover, there's a tendency, particularly with children, to say, look, they're getting better. Kids love a routine. Let's go back to learning. They're better now. Well, they're better, but they're not all better. And if you withdraw the support too soon, some people don't make it back to their baseline. They just have a new baseline they call continued impairment. Sometimes what happens is that when individuals are in that period where they're doing a bit better, they sometimes will feel helpless and hopeless and conclude that they're not going to make it back to their baseline. They presume that other people look to be functioning well, and they go, they're okay, I'll never get to that point. And that's when they can actually self-harm. So when I was in New Orleans 3 to 4 months after Katrina, I was talking to healthcare providers. People could list stories of people they knew who had killed themselves since the hurricane. There was actually a supplement to Pediatrics, the medical journal, dedicated to a young pediatrician who killed himself in New Orleans after the flooding. And I remember talking to one family and one person, and they said, actually, I knew someone, young couple, husband and wife and a young child. Their home was flooded. They couldn't go back to the home because it was a safety issue. Finally, they were given permission to do that, like a couple months later. They go with a U-Haul. They go through all of their home. They pick out everything they can salvage, pack the U-Haul. The dad says, I have one more thing to do, watch the kid, to his wife, goes in and shoots and kills himself. So he left his family on the curb with everything they owned. And people were like, how could you do that? I didn't meet the guy, and I don't want to make assumptions. But I imagine one thing that may have occurred was he may have done everything he thought he could do and didn't think he could do enough to get back. And so there's a certain amount where that's a really vulnerable time period. So what we tell people is you need to continue the support until, I'm trying to figure out what would be the best way. You need to continue the support until people are at least back at their baseline. And if you do that, many or most people will actually reach their baseline. But some individuals will exceed their baseline. And this is what I referred to before as post-traumatic growth. People may emerge from these events more resilient, with new skills to deal with adversity in the future, a better sense of spirituality, of empathy, of the ability to help others in different ways because of their experience. And I was going over this with a group of foster parents after a natural disaster. And one of the dads said, I think that's actually me. And he was in finance, very successful financially, young, married, happily married, had a young child, and the child died of a medical condition very quickly. And he said, all of a sudden, I questioned many of the things I was doing. And for one thing, I questioned why I was in finance. I'm just making money off of other people's money while other people lose money. He said, what am I really contributing to society by doing that? Yeah, I'm making money, but what does money get you? You know, it doesn't get you a healthy child. It doesn't get you a better life or a better society. So he said, I quit my job in finance, even though I was doing well successfully, very successful, and I went back to college to become a kindergarten teacher, because shaping the lives of young children, that's a career, you know, that I can feel comfortable with. And then he said, and then I became a foster parent, and I'm adopting a young child now. And he said, so I must have gone through post-traumatic growth. And to be quite honest, I think he was. And I think that's great. And I will tell you that the more people I speak to, whether they're in pediatrics, in particular, in medicine in general, but also in education, in mental health fields. I'm in a school of social work now, among social workers. They often are in the field because of something that happened to them as a child. Either they got help from someone and they valued it and decided they wanted to be like that person, or they recognized they didn't get that help and they want to be that person that wasn't there for them. I've interviewed people for medical school, residency, fellowship programs, all in all different levels related to pediatrics. It's generally in the personal statement, second sentence of the first paragraph. It's like class. I don't tell them that, but it's usually when I was 8 years old. There's a way they write the personal statement. So the first, you don't want to talk about the death in the first sentence because that's a little creepy. So what they do is they kind of go, I knew when I was a young child that I always wanted to be a pediatrician. When I was 8 years old, and my sister died of whatever, my cousin, or saw someone, and then they tell you what happened, and then they're devoting their life to take care of children so that that doesn't happen to them. That's just very common. Now, so that's not a bad thing. Post-traumatic growth is the best thing you can get if you've had trauma or loss. By the way, it's just better not to have gone through the event. What you gain is not worth usually what you lost. I'm not saying it's a good thing, but the problem with it is that you carry that forward with you, and when you go to help someone, like you're in a helping profession, you uncover your prior experience personally, and that causes distress. So we have to recognize that those who go into these professions to help children are actually, because of why they're there, often vulnerable to be hurt by it. Because it doesn't bother you if you're insensitive, but it's the sensitive people that go into the field. And if there are people who are insensitive in the field, they don't do well, and we don't really want them there. So we just have to recognize it's distressing to be with children who are in distress, and it's critical that staff find ways to have their own personal needs met and appreciate and address the impact of supporting children and adults, whether they be grieving or traumatized. And we have to create a culture where it's okay to be upset. A lot of times doctors will say to me, but I might get upset if I talk to the family. And I'm like, well, then they would know that you're human, and they like that. So it's not a problem. If you get a little choked up, if you express that it bothers you, that's perfectly okay. In fact, it's probably better than looking insensitive. And we have to normalize asking for help and model a willingness to accept assistance. Now, there will be situations where you're overwhelmed by your own personal experience because it's very recent, it's very difficult, and in those situations you do need to attend to yourself, have someone else talk to the child. So I'm not, there are times where you do not have the ability to distance yourself enough from your prior experience to be able to attend to the needs of the child or client, and that is a problem. So if you get overwhelmed, then you're not in the right space at that time. But I've had too many people say to me, it bothers me. I remember having one doctor come to me. She actually applied for a job in a clinical program that I had responsibility for. And I was like, why are you applying for this position? You're in the middle of training to be an oncologist. And she said, yeah, I'm thinking I'm not going to do that. And I said, why? And she said, it bothers me when children die. And I was like, well, it should. It's upsetting. If it doesn't bother you that children die, you shouldn't be taking care of them. And I looked at her and I'm like, what's going on? And so there was a lot of stress at the time. She was trying to raise several children while she was going through training. She didn't feel the training directors understood it or would be sensitive. And I looked at her and I'm like, okay, look, I'm going to be quite honest to you. I really want to hire you for this position because otherwise I'm going to have to do the work myself. And you're probably one of the best trainees I've ever met. And you do a great job, but I'm actually not going to let you look at the position because you need to go back and talk to your training directors. And she said, they won't understand. I said, you don't know that until you've talked to them. And I think you're too good to leave the career that you're in. That's not the right reason to take this position. It shouldn't be an excuse for getting out of something that's difficult, but that's important to you. And so she went back, she talked with them. They were very understanding. They accommodated her schedule. She finished the program. She came up to me like 7 years later at a conference. She said, you won't remember me. And I go, of course I remember. You were a trainee with me. And the position that you didn't take, no one ever did take, and I had to do all the work for 7 years. So I remember that quite well. And she looked at me and she said, you know, I almost left my career, but you didn't let me. And she goes, and now I'm an oncologist and I'm good at it and I love it. So the issue is, it's not I remember speaking with a group of trainees in the intensive care unit in one hospital. And I said, there are going to be times when you're going to ask, why would anybody ever do this job? Like, why would I choose to be around kids that are dying or who have died or are at risk of dying? At very high stress, why did I choose this? And you probably may even have a list that you've written out. And one of the younger people earlier in the training said, wait, other people feel that way? And his colleagues just said, oh, come on, we all feel that way. And he goes, I just thought it was me. So the issue is we just have to recognize you will have those moments. And that just means you're connected to what you're doing, which means you're better at what you do. But you have to take care of yourself. So we'll talk a little bit at the end about professional self-care. Let me speak now about bereavement. I'm going to skip through some of these slides just because some of it I've already covered, and some I was responding to questions, so I want to make sure I get to the content that's most relevant. This slide just talks about the fact that most educators have never learned anything about bereavement, and that's why they don't talk to kids about it. They just don't feel prepared. And only 7% of teachers have ever gotten any training. But yet, loss is very common in the lives of children. We know the vast majority of children experience the death of a family member or a friend by the time they complete high school. It's about 90%. And 4 to 5% of children in the US experience the death of a parent, specifically by the time they reach 16. So you're going to have kids who have experienced loss in your classes, in your groups all the time, but you may not recognize it. And so children may not appear to be grieving for the reasons I already went over. Adults may have communicated through their actions and their reactions that death is not something to be openly discussed. But children may also not yet understand what's happened or the longer-term implications. Adults tend to think about what they're going to lose as a result, the secondary losses that come when someone dies. I remember one woman, her husband had a heart attack, and as she's doing CPR on him, after she finds him, she's sobbing, and she's yelling at him, don't die and leave me to raise this kid alone. Now, the kid was watching. He was like 4, and his mother looks like he's beating up dad, and dad's dead after. So that's a whole other issue about how you then process that. But that's a little self-centered. I mean, I'm not being critical of it, that he's not even dead yet, and you're already thinking about raising the child, but that's what adults do. They often skip right ahead to, what am I going to do when I retire? Or I'm going to be in retirement alone. And it's like, well, that's like in 20 years. So kids don't do that as much. So they don't recognize often the secondary losses that are in the future. So they grow into their grief. And so as they get older, when they're about to graduate high school, they'll be like, Dad died when I was 5, and he should be here for my high school graduation. And then they say, how am I going to be a father? My father died when I was young. I need him then. So they start to realize it over time. Whereas adults, sometimes it floods them. They think about all of those things. Or kids can be so overwhelmed by their feelings, they don't want to talk about it because they're afraid they can't pull it together and go back on with their school day. Or they may express their grief indirectly through their behavior or through their play. There's lots of games that kids play about death, where death is the theme of the game. So there's one game that children play in every culture in the world in the first year of life, and it's about death. You've all played it. Which one? Ring Around the Rosie is after the first year of life, generally because they have peekaboo. So what happens then is we know that infants in the first couple months of life, they don't have object permanence. So if something is out of sight, it is literally out of mind. So as a result, they don't grieve every time someone walks out of the room because it's almost like they forget that they continue to exist. As they start to develop object permanence, they start to get stranger anxiety. They'll wake up in the middle of the night and scream until they're reunited with a parent or caregiver, because they wake up and they're like, wait, Mom, Dad, not here. I'm alone. And they start crying. Often the parents assume that means that they're hungry or their diaper's wet, but they were eating the same amount before and their diapers were just the same before. It's once they develop object permanence, they can feel loss and they can grieve. And when they start to do that, they start to play peekaboo. And in peekaboo, what happens is the person, often it starts with the infant fixing their gaze on an attachment figure, but it can be a stranger. There's separation as if the person has died, heightened awareness and concern, and then joy at reunion, and then the kid's got to play it again, because that doesn't really answer it for them. They're afraid of permanent loss. So you've all played this with kids. If you translate peekaboo, it's from Old English. What are you actually saying? I'm sorry? Peekaboo is alive or dead. That's what the game's about. And so kids are playing games about death starting at about 6 to 9 months of age in every culture in the world. And so you have to ask yourself, why does everybody do it? And why do the kids want to keep doing it? And then it goes to hide and seek and it's other things afterwards. But it's all of these, they are concerned about loss. So they are talking about it from very young ages, and often they do it through their play. In contrast, adults don't talk about it. And they'll say, you know, I don't want to upset the kids by reminding them that their parent died. And I'm like, seriously, you don't think they know and are thinking about it every moment when it's just happened? And if you say to them, I hear your mom died, how are you feeling? And they start crying, you know it's not your question that's upsetting them. You're just inviting them to share how they feel. You're not causing the distress. You're giving them permission to share the distress. So then they say, well, I'm afraid that I'm just going to make matters worse. And if you don't know the right things to say, it's better to say nothing at all. I always tell people, if that's the case, then we would say very little to our own children. And by the time they're adolescents, we would be functionally mute. I mean, if we had that view, that if I don't know exactly what to say, I'm not going to say anything, we would just be like, whatever, you know, raise yourself. Which some parents do, but it's not an effective parenting technique. So saying nothing says a lot to kids. It communicates that adults are unconcerned, uncaring, or just unable or unwilling to be of assistance, and it just leaves kids to grieve alone. So let me go over some of the things that you might want to avoid or reconsider saying when someone is in distress. Now this is in the situation when it's not your own child, it's not a peer, it's when it's a child who is coming to you in your professional capacity. Okay, so it's where it's really all about the needs of the child. And so what you want, and this is after an acute loss. So you don't want to try and cheer up survivors. I tell people anything that begins with at least should be reconsidered. At least he's not in pain anymore. At least you still have a brother, even though your sister died. You know, at least you had the holidays together. That's our way of saying, look, you're starting to upset me because you're upset, and I don't want to see that anymore. So let's put a smile on that so I feel like I've either helped you or I don't have to deal with this. It's not helpful to the person who's grieving. You don't want to encourage them to be strong or cover their emotions, and you should express your feelings and demonstrate empathy. As I already said, it's not unprofessional to show that you are touched by what's happened to people. But you want to avoid statements such as, I know exactly what you're going through, because you really can't, without asking people what they're going through. You don't want to say things like, you must be angry. You can say, you appear to be angry. I'm wondering if you are angry, but you shouldn't tell them you must be angry. You shouldn't tell people how they ought to feel. I remember after a family member died, I was talking to my accountant, and he said things like, I know what you're going through. You'll think this. And I felt like saying, actually, no, that is, it wasn't how I felt. But it didn't upset me because I had enough distance from this to be able to say, how nice my accountant is showing concern. I mean, yes, there's a tax implication to the death of this family member. We could just be talking about that, but instead he's sharing his personal experiences and acknowledging that this must be difficult. The advice he has given is wrong, but it's so nice of him to even try. So it didn't bother me, but part of me was like, no, actually, I'm not having that issue. And then some people will wonder, is there something wrong with me? I don't feel that way. Or, no, that isn't how, I don't want to feel that way, or that isn't how I feel. So it's really better, again, to ask. The next one is sometimes we share our own loss story. And when we share a loss story, people tend to do that to say, well, let me connect with you, to show you that I know what this experience is like because I've been through it. Well, if 90% of the US population has been through it by the time they finish high school, all the adults have already been through it. So that's kind of a given anyway. And kids really don't need proof of your competence. If you just show how to help them, they will perceive you as competent. You don't have to prove your credentials. Like you wouldn't say, today we're going to do long division. I actually took 3 courses of this when I was in teacher preparation. I passed the exam, and I've actually done this a lot. I balanced the checkbook successfully last night. You just would not say that. It would be odd. So I don't know why we have to start sharing our personal loss stories unless we don't feel competent. And so that's something we should deal with. And when you share your loss story, you tend to make a comparison. And either you will say something that pales in comparison. Had one nurse tell a family, I know what you're going through when your infant died this weekend. My dog died this weekend. They were insulted. But if the kid says to you their dog died and you say, I know what you're going through, my mother died last night, then they're like, are you okay? So then they have to start taking care of you. And this is a situation where it's all about the kid's needs and you're a professional. And you shouldn't be bringing your personal needs into the relationship. So there are times where it's appropriate to share personal stories. I've shared some. They are all done consciously, not because I need help with them. Like you're not going to help my wife or help me around my wife's thing about the alarm clock. I know that. I know I'm stuck with that one, unless somebody's volunteering. But it's not going to happen. So I'm not bringing it up because I need your help with it. I'm bringing it up to illustrate a point. So you can do that when you're doing presentations. By the way, I'm very different when I'm counseling. I don't bring up my family or my personal issues. I don't think that's appropriate. But there may be circumstances where you wish to, and it's okay. And you don't have to raise your hand and say, but what about this? These are all just general suggestions. It's just something for you to think about. What you really want to do in general is allow the child and family to be upset and tolerate the unpleasant affect without trying to change it. I think we spend too much time trying to judge, is this normal or abnormal? It is what it is. Now, the caveat to that is you intervene when safety or health is concerned. If they're homicidal or suicidal or doing something self-destructive, or they've been drinking and they're going to get into a car, then you need to make sure that they are safe. And that becomes an emergency, irrespective of whether or not they're grieving. But if they're not in danger, they're not hurting themselves or someone else, but they're just upset in a way that you didn't expect, I tend to just let it play out and be with them and try not to pass a judgment on it. Because once you communicate to them, that's not normal what you're doing, then they don't share with you anymore. So if you say, I'm sorry, the way you're acting is abnormal, so I'm going to ask a social worker to come in and talk with you. They're not going to talk to the social worker. And if you just say, I don't understand how anyone is supposed to react to something like this, I can only imagine that it's extremely distressing. I'd like to invite a social worker to talk with. Then they may say, okay. So I would be a little careful about making judgments. One of the other reasons that people remain silent or don't intervene is because they're worried they're going to say or do the wrong thing because they feel ill-informed about another culture and what their cultural practices are. And I'm going to go through some of these slides, just going over the key points so I can get to the stuff at the end. The bottom line is I think that it's a universal experience when grief is. And yes, there are different ways that it's manifest, and there are different cultural practices, but you can ask the person what that is. You don't have to make assumptions based on what you know about what Hindu families do or what women do in Hispanic society. I think once you start with these generalizations, they tend to be stereotypes at one level. So you do want to know that there generally are differences and know some of those differences. But people come from blended families and different cultural backgrounds. And when we make certain assumptions about people based on what we perceive to be their ethnicity, their culture, their race, we just sometimes we just play into stereotypes, and that clouds our perceptions, and it can make us miss opportunities to be helpful. So, I often tell people assume because of my last name that I'm Jewish. I am not Jewish. My dad was Jewish, but my mother was Sicilian Catholic and raised, she went to Catholic school. My dad came from an Orthodox Jewish family. So it was an interesting blend. But people assume that I'm Jewish because of my name. And so they don't know I was raised Catholic. I was an altar boy when I was in elementary school. I'm not half Jewish. I get that too. Well, you must be half Jewish. I'm like, it doesn't really work that way. And so what I get is, when I bought my house in Los Angeles, the realtor made a point of saying, it's in a good Jewish neighborhood. You'll be around a lot of other Jewish families. You can walk to a synagogue. And I felt like saying, get me a house near some Christians. I don't feel that way. But it's just like, what do you say to that? It creates distance because I know he's trying to connect with me because he's Jewish, but we are not of that same group. So they're saying, look, we're similar because of this, and I'm saying, no, we're not. So you just pointed out a difference. It's not a difference that matters to me, so it didn't bother me. So I see it as, you're trying, thank you, that's very kind. It's not really relevant. But then I have one person who has sent me emails and letters on Yom Kippur for like 15 years. I don't have the heart to tell her I'm not Jewish. So I just keep saying, thank you, I wish you the same. I'm like, okay, I remember my daughter was in a position and they were like, everybody else in that group was Jewish, and they said, and she goes, I think they think I'm Jewish. And I'm like, go with it, dear. Like, you're advancing in the company. Like, this is not the time to tell them, actually, no, I'm not. So I think sometimes it's just, you make that assumption and it can actually put distance. So I was talking with one of the Amish families after the schoolhouse shooting, and I was going through the home with one of the grandparents of a kid who was murdered. And she walked over and she showed me on the wall a picture of her granddaughter. And she said, one day my kids were out playing, my grandchildren were out playing, and I went out to check on them, and there was a photographer from New York who had stopped and was taking pictures of my children. And I stopped him and I said, look, sir, we do not take pictures in our culture. We consider them graven images. It's against our culture, our religious belief. It's a violation of what we consider to be appropriate. I'm going to ask you not to take any more pictures. And my granddaughter looked up to me and she said, oh, Grandma, please. He said he'd send me a copy. I really want it. And she said, I was so embarrassed I agreed to it. And she goes, what a gift from God. Otherwise, I wouldn't have it. So if I had said to her, Amish families do not use pictures as transitional objects after the death of a child because it violates their religious beliefs, how would she have ever been able to tell me that's what she was doing? And so the issue is, and the Amish tend to keep to their culture, but if you imagine, I'm sure a lot of you come from families that are not all one cultural background. And so that with all of these blending, and then some people who are like, my kid died. I don't, in my religion, we don't believe in an afterlife. I'm not okay with that now. I'm thinking of being Hindu. So people may actually just pick from something that's very different because what they have isn't working for them. And, we can't force them into that box and tell them that that's what they're supposed to do. So I just say, approach the family with an open mind and heart and just ask them what they generally do, what they find works, what they think would be helpful. Now, you do need to know their differences. So, the example I often use is, you could say in a Hindu, like if you have a Muslim family, for example, you shouldn't be generally putting your arm around a female if you're a male provider, because that may be considered inappropriate. Yes, but quite honestly, I wouldn't put my arm around anybody unless I asked them, because there are many other reasons they may not want you to do that. So you need to know their differences, but I certainly wouldn't go around hugging everyone in the room, and then when I get to the person who's wearing a burqa, go, I know I'm not supposed to give you up. That's just not what you do. So you would ask each person, and I would say you would ask them as well. And you can say, I know this may not be part of your belief system. I feel like, I want to help you. Would it bother you if I gave you a hug, if you're the teacher? And if the kid says, it doesn't work for me, then I'd say, what else would? How do I show concern in connection with you if that's not what works for you right now? So you just ask people. I've gone to a lot of different countries, and I've learned, I just ask. I remember spending a sabbatical in Japan, and I just said to the translators, your job is to make me look like I'm not a fool. You know, like, tell me what I don't know, so that I can kind of fit in. And what was interesting was they looked at me and they said, yes, we have different traditions and practices. We don't expect Americans to know or follow them. Just be respectful and kind and considerate, and we will forgive if you put the wrong slippers on or forget to change your slippers at the bathroom or sneeze without covering, without turning to the wall or whatever. Because I was kind of like, I got allergies. I sneeze and cough all the time, but you're not supposed to use tissue. You know, you're not supposed to do that publicly. I'm like, what do you do? And I watch some people, they kneel in the corner to blow their nose, and I'm like, I don't think I would ever do that. And my kids were like, Dad, do we have to do that? And I'm like, well, no. I mean, so that people understand that your differences, but they also appreciate when you're empathic. And that you can do in any culture. So I've been in, a lot of different events where, the hugely different cultural practices. And I need to know that they're different. And I ask them how it's different, but I'm usually able to mediate across that. So I'm going to turn to just a couple things about grief that I did want to cover. One is to talk about guilt. And so for very young children, their thought processes are limited in a number of ways. For one thing, they're very egocentric. And here's Calvin explaining what that means. He says, I'm at peace with the world, I'm completely serene. And Hobbes asks, why is that? And he says, I've discovered my purpose in life. I know why I was put here and why everything exists. And Hobbes says, oh, really? And he says, yes, I'm here so everybody can do what I want. That's the egocentrism of a young child. And they approach death in the same way. So here, Calvin's very perceptive. So when Hobbes asks, oh, really, he says, yes, I'm here so everybody can do what I want. And then Hobbes says it's nice to have that cleared up. Calvin adds, once everyone accepts it, they'll be serene too. That's like really perceptive of Calvin to realize it. But as I said, they approach death the same way. He says, don't die, little raccoon. It wouldn't be very grateful of you to break my heart. This is a very egocentric perspective, but that's what happens. And as I had already mentioned, it happens with adults. We go back to that too. It's just adults know that that's socially not acceptable to be egocentric, and so they then feel more guilty than the kids do. Kids, though, at this age also have very limited understanding of causality, so they don't know why people die. And if you don't know why people die and you're egocentric, the most logical conclusion is it's because of something I did, didn't do, should have done, or could have done. And so that's where they get that magical thinking, that our thoughts, beliefs, actions, and inactions create things in the world that we have no control over in reality. And, so I use the example cautiously that, if you really raise your child to believe in Santa Claus, which I did with my kids, but if you tell them that if you do something good, like eat your vegetables on December 1st, some dude in the North Pole who you haven't told is going to somehow know that and care, and nobody leaves vegetables for Santa Claus. It's not likely to be the main part of his diet, according to the folklore. Not met him personally. And so he's going to care so much about that, he's going to have elves make a toy for you in a workshop and bring it by sled, pulled by reindeer, come down to your chimney. It's pretty far-fetched, okay? I'm not going to say whether or not it happens because we all have our inner child, and I don't want to violate those assumptions. But if you have your sister and you kick her one day, and 3 weeks later she gets diagnosed with cancer, and 4 weeks later she dies, that's your fault. And that is much more logical and much less far-fetched than the whole Santa thing. So the magical thinking makes kids feel powerless because they otherwise live in a world that feels totally out of control and unpredictable. So we give them that illusion of control. That illusion of control is a liability when bad things happen. And you can't take it sometimes and not keep it the other times. So if you feel in control through magical thinking, you feel guilty when horrible things happen. And it doesn't matter what people tell you. I mean, I've had kids who have given all the right explanations. They tell you all the right explanations. And then you finally they warm up to you, and you say, so why did your brother die? And they go, because I went to camp that day. Or because I forgot to check this. And so people, we tend to feel that at some level, people have a choice when a catastrophic event occurs, whether that's a death or a major crisis. Either they recognize that they had no role to play in it, which means it can happen again, or they give themselves the illusion of control by adopting guilt, which makes them feel that if they don't make the same mistake again, it won't happen again. But it's an illusion of control, and you have to deal with the guilt. So it's not a good coping mechanism, but that's often what happens. Sometimes they blame someone else, and then, if there's a school shooting, the superintendent has to be removed because they should have known. Now you can say, how would they know? But if they don't know, and no one knows, and no one was at fault, then what prevents it from happening in the school where your other child attends? And that's just not tolerable for people. So someone has to be removed. Someone has to be blamed. Someone's career is damaged by it. And I think that's something we have to be really cautious about, because quite honestly, destabilizing systems in crisis is not a good thing. So it would be kind of like saying your dad died, so my mother's got to get out. She should have prevented it, so now I'm an orphan. That's just not helpful. Same thing in systems. So, and I'm not saying that people who are responsible shouldn't have to deal with that responsibility, but in many, many situations, it's more blame than responsibility. So what you have to do is recognize that guilt is common, and I mentioned that I've only seen 2 or 3 cases where there wasn't guilt after 30 years. It's just so ubiquitous. And so Calvin, he calls for his mom, and he says, a big dog knocked me down and he stole Hobbs. I tried to catch him, but I couldn't, and now I've lost my best friend. And his mother says, well, Calvin, if you wouldn't drag that tiger everywhere, things like this wouldn't happen. And he adds, there's no problem so awful you can't add some guilt to it and make it even worse. So you just need to expect that that's going to happen. And I actually articulate to people, children and adults, of their lack of responsibility. I say when bad things happen, we feel badly. And when we feel badly, we often assume we did something bad. Feeling guilty doesn't mean you are guilty. I know there was nothing you did, didn't do, should have done, or could have done that would have changed this. But most kids tell me they feel that way. Have you ever felt that way? And that is often all it takes. I had one girl actually write me a letter after a presentation. All the kids wrote letters. The teacher asked them to. It was that third, fourth grade class. And her letter just said, Dear Dr. Schonfeld, thank you for coming to our class and talking about what happens when someone dies. Now I know it's not my fault my father killed himself. And that she signed her name and said, Happy Valentine's Day. So I'm not saying that my comment or presentation is enough to deal with the guilt that's associated with suicide of a parent. But it actually is enough, sometimes a single conversation, to get a child to be able to share with you that they feel that way. And that's one of the first steps. Because when they tell you, I'm responsible, and you go, you're not. I'm not shocked by that. They feel like they've just disclosed that they're responsible, like you're going to arrest them afterwards, or hate them, or think they're horrible. And when you don't get shocked, and you say, well, people feel that way, but it isn't the case, then often that's very helpful, and sometimes that's actually enough. It isn't always, though. I was just going to go a little bit over misconceptions and literal misinterpretations, because the thought processes of children are concrete and literal. They tend to sometimes misunderstand what you've said. Here he asks if the milk is spoiled, and his mom says, smell it and see, and he says, I'm not going to smell it, you smell it. And instead of asking why is he concerned, she just says, oh, for goodness sake, here it's fine. And then he says offhandedly, I don't take chances with a product that prints the dates you might expire. So sometimes kids don't quite get it right. And these little misinterpretations are funny, but they're not when it means that you're afraid you're going to die or someone you care about dies. So you can tell kids that the body is placed in a box that we call a casket, and they don't want to look, because when you say the body is placed in a casket, some kids assume the head is placed someplace else. And so they get it just a little off, and then they're scared, and you don't know because you're not asking them what's the problem. And so, or sometimes they have a belief. It's not a literal misinterpretation, it's a misconception. I took care of one kid, he was about 12, and he was in the hospital. He had sickle cell disease, and he was having these dizzy spells, and we were concerned they were transient ischemic attacks, small strokes from the sickle cell disease. And that's very dangerous because sometimes then you have a larger stroke, and it causes loss of brain function. So I'm talking with the kid, and this was when I was in training, and we actually kept kids in the hospital long enough where you could talk to them. And you didn't have an electronic health record, so you actually spoke to people. So I was sitting there getting to know the kid, and it was about the 5th day of his hospitalization, and he just said to me, you know, Doc, I'm the oldest. And I said, the oldest what? He says, I'm the oldest kid with sickle cell. And he goes, and I said, where? Like in the world? And he goes, I don't know about that, but the oldest one in clinic. And I said, well, what do you think happens when you get older? You're 12. And he said, I suppose then you die. And I said, no, we transfer to the adult clinic across the street at 13. You don't die, you cross the street. And he looked at me and he goes, are you kidding? Now, this was before HIPAA, and so there was an 18-year-old on the ward for sickle cell disease as well, and I introduced them, they talked, and then he walked up to me and said, Doc, I'm ready to go home, I feel better. So he had a 1-week hospitalization because he was afraid he was dying because no one explained to him the transfer policy of the clinic. Now, I don't fault the clinic for that. I'm not saying, it's just you don't know what's bothering them. I've had this happen time and again. It's not just children, it's parents, kids and adults. It just gets something a little off and it causes a lot of distress. So religious explanations can be shared, but they shouldn't be the only explanation about death. I had one kid who was told his brother was such a good little baby, God wanted him back at his side as an angel. That's what his parents told him. And so he decided to make it very clear that when he went to church, which was God's home, he wasn't that good. And he spent the whole Mass trying to be as misbehave as much as possible so he wasn't struck dead. This went on for 4 months, and the parents didn't make the connection. You know, they go, oh, he's grieving, you know, so he's misbehaving, he's out of control. And they didn't know it was just the explanation that they gave him until I started asking some questions, incidentally. This slide on adolescent bereavement is just to kind of say that adolescents have all the same issues that I mentioned with young children. I'm not going to go over it. They still need information. They still need support. They're often left with more responsibility and less support. This next slide is around cumulative loss, which was what I already talked about. So I'm just going to skip over that. This slide talks about how to provide advice to support children around common things. So for funeral attendance, I'm often asked at what age is it helpful for a child to go to a funeral? And my answer is, no matter how old the child is, if you can explain it to them, and invite them to participate to the level they wish. Best to assign a mentor through the experience who's not personally grieving, who the child likes. So that could be a teacher, that could be a social worker at school, it could be someone from church. Someone who isn't grieving themselves but can come to the activities to attend to the child and see how the child's doing. And when the child starts to be squirming a lot, you take them out of the room. You go walk to your car. You ask them if they want to go have ice cream. You ask them if they just want to stand outside and play. You know, you let the kid, you titrate their level of involvement based on what they want. You want to be aware of community resources and offer them to families. So, as already mentioned in the beginning, do you know your local bereavement camp? Do you know your local bereavement center and programs? Make sure that they know about it as well, and that it's a resource that you recommend. And then provide follow-up. So you want to remember that grieving is long-term. So I'm going to show you a brief video about grief triggers. It's about 2 minutes long. And part of the reason I'm doing this, I'm going to talk about the coalition material, and we have a lot of videos. So I wanted to share with you an example. I first want to figure out, well, let's see if, okay, it will start up in a moment.
Right now, my biology class is studying blood vessels, and my dad died of an aneurysm. So we were talking about disorders, and my teacher talked about aneurysm, and she asked what could happen with an aneurysm, and I raised my hand and I told her that it could burst, and if that was in the brain, it could be fatal. So we talked about that, and it's not my biology teacher's fault. It's a unit. I understand that completely. But it's a reminder of how ironic things can be sometimes. Someone can say something that's not relevant to them, but it can have a really big effect on you. Today in Spanish class, actually, my friend Kate, she's a great friend of mine, we were joking because we had a biology test the previous period, and it was a pretty hard test. So we were joking, we were saying that we were gonna get heart attacks or we were gonna pass out, and she was like, hey, I have an aneurysm. And she was like, she just kind of began shaking and stuff, and I didn't get mad at her because she didn't understand, and I hadn't told her because I just met her this year.
On a Father's Day in 3rd grade, we were making bookmarks that said father, and then we write words, and the teacher was explaining it, and I was like right about to cry because I couldn't make one. So I asked to go to the bathroom, and then I started crying in the bathroom.
teachers look for overt signs, but grief is more subtle than that. It's not always Father's Day that's going to trigger a grief. It could be career day. It could be what does your parent do for a living that is going to trigger it.
So grief triggers happen all the time in school and outside of the school, and they tend to catch people off guard and make them feel overwhelmed that they thought they were doing okay and now something reminds them. It can be a song, a smell, it can be just the sound of laughter of someone that reminds you of your mom's laughter. It can be almost anything. And so if you know that something may be a likely trigger, so if you're going to do the Father's Day activity, you should say to your class, we're going to do a Father's Day activity. Some of you may not have a father who is alive or currently living with you. You can still do this in their memory, or you can pick another male in your family who has been a help for you. That way we can all do the activity. And then it just doesn't take that long. And then you can follow up with individual kids if they have any questions. That also deals with all the ambiguous losses, incarceration, deployment, divorce, separation. All of the other types of loss situations can also be incorporated. But if you have a kid who's just lost a close family member, tell them that these things happen. Let them know if they need to get up and walk out of class. They're invited to do so. You know where they're going. You know when they're coming back. You provide a safe space or an adult that the student can talk to. Give them a procedure for getting that support. And if you do that, actually, most kids don't need to leave, because it's the feeling trapped and overwhelmed part that is what's so upsetting. So if they know they can get up, then they don't need to get up, because the feelings usually pass fairly quickly. So that's just one example of some of the things that you're going to find on the Coalition to Support Grieving Students website. We came together back about 5 years ago, the two teachers' unions, AFT and the NEA, 4 school superintendent and principal organizations, and organizations representing school nurses, psychologists, social workers, and counselors. Since that time, we've had about 25 other national and professional organizations join, and a large number of other friends of the coalition that are regional or state level or local groups. So it's now over 75, I think close to 80 at this point. And we created grievingstudents.org. And there you'll find over 20 video-based modules, cover a wide range of topics on how to support grieving kids. It's all free of charge. And you don't have to register. I have resisted all attempts where people have said, make them sign in so we know who's getting this. I'm like, no, we don't have them sign in. So you can, it's even mobile enabled. So you can get a 7-minute video on how to deal with something related to bereavement on your cell phone, and you can just watch that. And if it's more than 5 minutes long, we chaptered it. Like, those of you still remember DVDs? I know we don't have those anymore. But if they were long movies, you could go to different chapters, so you can actually watch the first 4 minutes and come back and watch the next 4 minutes. By the way, no one does that, to be quite honest. They watch the whole thing. They're only 7 to 10 minutes, most of them. But we have that capacity if you wish to do that. I'm going to show you one last clip. I'm just going to show you.
I think some.
Unfortunately, I can't figure out how to get the pointer so that I have to watch the whole thing.
The curriculum,
it's about 3 minutes.
Core lesson plans become so much that we forget we got these little human beings in front of us who are going through different pain and suffering. And you got to develop that relationship. That way when something happens, you want the child to respect you enough that they can come to you and talk to you. But if you don't have that relationship built, there's going to be a wall up, and you're just going to get this, very angry, hurt, painful individual in your class. And then what do? We wind up suspending the guy who's suffering. We suspend him because we don't know how to deal with his behavior and his actions.
I did a lesson on St. Valentine's Day. It was writing a letter to a parent to say thank you. And then I learned that some of our kids don't live with the parents for whatever reason. Either they're passed away or they're just not around. And that brought up a lot of conversations among the students. So I had to really learn about my students outside the school. I know they're academics, but socially, I never made a point in learning what they have to do outside or how they live their lives. So that made me re-edit my curriculum and not take it out, but address it differently in terms of family is whoever's next to you, whoever takes care of you at that time.
I will say that you never are prepared to be in an emergency room sitting next to a parent with no one else in the room, and the doctor coming in and saying, You just lost your son. But yet I was there for that parent, and I was glad I was there. But textbooks don't talk about that when you go through your classes. And I
We
think
did write a
just
textbook
being a
that does, but
compassionate
that's an aside.
human being is important to be there for people. So I learned a lot as a human being from that end of it. And I was glad I was there for that mom.
2 years ago, I had a student come back from a funeral. And the kids told me that his mother was in the hospital and that's why he hasn't been at school. I said, oh, okay. So then when he came back, I said, Jonathan, he said, my mom passed. I had no idea. No one warned me. And I said, Jonathan. And I hugged him, and then I looked at him, and I was gonna lose it because my heart, your mother, And he looked at me and he goes, Jackie, please don't. And I said, okay. So he didn't want to talk about it. And the only thing I let him know is, when you're ready, I'm here. And we're all here for you. And my door is always open. And, maybe 3 weeks later, he came to me and said, thank you. And I look up from my desk, what are you thanking me for? He said, I just want you to know, thank you. And I said, Jonathan, you're welcome. And I don't know what I did. He goes, you were here and I didn't have to talk about it. So I realized then, I wish I realized that sooner. Sometimes you don't want to talk about it. You want to be somewhere where you can forget that you're grieving. So I think you have to, as an educator, it's like a dance. I'm going to take a step forward. If you start the dance with me, I can take the next step. If they stop and they're not able to, okay, we can stay here and just listen to the music.
And I think what that teacher demonstrates is what it means to have an empathic presence. And that's really what kids need. So yes, we can talk about the fact that trauma and loss has an impact and what it does to you, but you really need to learn how to do that, to be that presence for a child, because that's what they really need. And I don't know this teacher, I just met her when I interviewed her, but I'd want her to teach my kid. So it makes such a difference in the lives of children, whether or not they experience loss or trauma, but a lot do for both. So the other slides just tell you about the different modules that are there. There's a wide range. There's one on suicide, commemoration, what to do if you have a life-limiting condition, like if a child is terminally ill in the school or staff member. And then we have additional print resources, modules if they're deaths related to the military or in the line of duty as a police, guidance documents on what to do about suicide or loss, different training modules so you can do presentations. There's family and school staff booklets. There's articles, a bunch of online resources. And this is a booklet, I have a copy here which I brought you can look at. It comes in English and Spanish in hard copy and also in Chinese and Japanese in PDF. You can download it as a PDF immediately after an event and send it out to everyone. You don't have to seek our permission. You can photocopy it. You can order hard copies. They are free of charge from New York Life and they pay the shipping and handling. So you can order them in bulk and have them available. And you can contact our center if you want more support. So I was going to show you some of the events we've been involved in. I don't know if you guys are interested in that, but you did ask questions so you can be spared. Did you want 2 minutes to just see some of the places we've been so you know that we're a resource? Okay, I'm going to go very quickly through it. We coordinated the school crisis training after the World Trade Center attack in New York after 9/11. We're working with Parkland, Florida after the shooting at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. We've gone out many times, at least once a month since the shooting has happened. I coordinated the initial response for the shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary School for Newtown Public Schools. We've gone and done some work for Las Vegas and Clark County schools after the shooting there. The school shooting in Benton, Kentucky, Spokane, Washington, Marysville, Washington, Corning, California. Did a lot with Aurora, Colorado after the shooting in the movie theater. Went out a couple times to Floresville, Texas, the church shooting in Sutherland Springs. That's the school district that serves most of their students. The school shooting in Platte Canyon, Colorado, Chardon, Ohio, Townville, South Carolina. These are just some examples. We've been out to a lot of different school shootings, but we do natural disasters too. Hurricane Maria in San Juan, Sandy in New York and New Jersey, Katrina in New Orleans, Ike in Galveston, tornado destruction in Joplin, Missouri, as well as Alabama, wildfires in Sonoma County, Sevier County, Tennessee, most recently also, for some reason, must have been an older slide. Oh, I made these and sent them before. Butte County, Paradise, Concow, and Chowchilla. So we've already been there a couple times, and we do international work as well. Akita Elementary stabbing in Osaka, the earthquake in China, a lot of international presentations. So these are some of the countries I've spoken in on the topic. So I just wanted to give you a sense that we do this work, and our center is, you can go to schoolcrisiscenter.org. There's a lot of crisis information there, and this is our contact information. You can call us. We have a toll-free number. Just recognize they all go to me, so there's not a lot of bandwidth here, but we will do our best, and we don't charge for the consultation. We actually come to some communities and also free of charge based on the grant that we have from New York Life. But we have social media channels. Please join them, like us, link to us. You'll find out about new material. We sent something out around Halloween about how do you talk about Day of the Dead? What is the impact of Halloween on grieving children? What's Thanksgiving? What's all the holidays? What do you do around graduation? We have these guidance documents and policies, and you'll get them. And the last slide that's there, just if you're curious, was I consulted to a children's television show, Mortimer Gibbons' Life on Normal Street, that's on Amazon Prime. It's no longer being filmed because the actors aged out of middle school age. They look like adults, so they stopped filming it. But they had one of the main characters, her mother dies in a car accident, and they worked with me to not only portray bereavement, but to do what I don't know other shows do, which was to show it for the rest of the series and demonstrate how to support kids in ways that normally don't happen. And so this clip on YouTube is a 3-minute interview of me on the set, and we're talking about what we tried to accomplish in the show. You don't need to see me anymore, but it actually has the actors acting out those scenes. They're very good. I didn't coach them, and I didn't write the script. The show won the Screenwriters Guild Award for the best children's television show about 1.5 years ago for this, but you might want to see it, and we're showing how we try and get it into mainstream media as well. So I went a couple minutes over. I'm going to turn it over to you to say goodbye.
Thank you. May I hug you?
Sure.
May I
Yeah,
hug
so
you?
of course.
I ask permission.
Yes.
Pardon me. Well, thank you all for, let me do this. Thank you all for giving us 3 hours of your life. And I hope that your experience today has touched you in the way that we are all just very human. And it takes courage to be human and care about another human being when they're experiencing loss and hurting themselves, and it touches you deeply inside. So I'm just going to encourage you to be brave every day and continue the good work that you're doing. I am going to direct you to your blue packet. Inside is an evaluation that we would love for you to fill out. Also, in this is our Camp Aaron brochure. These are for children that have had a loss. Deshay mentioned at the beginning, but you've been through 3 hours, so I want to remind you. There's also opportunities for volunteering, and particularly the men in the room. We're looking for men who can be camp buddies at camp and help us out in that way. You can apply online. We would love to just have you come and learn more about that if you care to do so. I also want to thank the Stanislaus County Office of Education. Without their support, this event would have not been possible both yesterday and today. And so we're just very thankful for their partnership in all this. And can you get the basket over there? So we're thrilled to do this work. Just want you to know that Community Hospice is here. You're not alone. And if you need us, please, we're just one phone call away. I would like to just once again recognize the outstanding shared experiences from Dr. Schonfeld. Please help me in thanking him. Go ahead. And we just have a small gift of local fare from Stuart and Jasper so he can munch on the plane ride home. So, just thank you again, and please have a safe drive home. And if you want to stay for a few minutes and have I have it right here. Thank you. Thank you for the kind reminder. So we do have a door prize, and I drew the name out of the big fishbowl. It's Dr. Schonfeld's A Teacher's Guide for the Grieving Student, and the winner is... He did. It's a signed book. Isn't that nice? Where is Chandra Rowley? Oh, there's Chandra. Congratulations. So fill out the evaluations and just leave them on the table for us. We'll collect them. So just wishing everybody a blessed and safe night. Thank you so much.